I claim that Palestinian groups have used children, have recruited children,
But
and
you
they've.
specifically said 14-year-olds.
This is the third such incident this year in which Palestinian children have been arrested at Israeli military checkpoints while carrying explosives or munitions. So I
Right. So
what
they're carrying explosives and munitions. That doesn't make them suicide bombers. Like all organizations who are insurgents are going to be moving around explosives. And you can see the temptation to use a child to do that.
Yeah, that's fucked up. Uh,
I
I
agree.
I don't see any reason to. I, we went from you saying that this is completely fabricated, it's not true,
It
to
isn't.
you walking it back and saying, well, there's no systemic use of children by
No, I
Palestinian
mean, it
groups.
isn't. There isn't a 14-year-old suicide bomber. You have
Right.
still
There's
not
no
shown me a
successful.
14-year-old.
There's no sex. I'll grant you that. I'll concede this. There's no
Right.
successful detonation by a 14-year-old.
Okay.
They're not screening for high competence teenagers. Or why can't their homeland be elsewhere? Why can't they move to neighboring countries?
Why can't the Jewish colonists move to neighboring countries?
Because
Why
they
can't
got
they go
kicked
back
out
to,
by the Arab population
but
throughout the
no,
late
they
20th
didn't.
century.
They didn't get cocked out by
What
the
was the
Arab
population
population.
of Jews in the Middle East and at the time of Israel's founding?
Something like 1.2 million people.
And what is it now?
It's very low because Israel recruited those people to come to Israel.
How did they manage to empty out all the Jews from the Middle East? They just convinced them to come to Israel?
Well, there were a variety of ways. One part of it certainly was a spike in anti-Semitism after the war and Israel's ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. That
Okay.
definitely was a factor, and an anticipated factor. If you look at the writings of Theodore Herzl, would love to see you turn some of that skepticism on Israel
I mean,
because you
there
seem
would
to
be
have
more
really
skepticism.
uncritically absorbed this really, really thin propaganda lie that Israel is seeking peace. That has
Well,
never been the case.
who first suggested having a peace treaty in recognition? Was it the Arab countries or Israel? That's a
I
simple
believe it was
question.
the Arab countries, but I could be wrong.
What?
No, like show me.
What's like the first year that an Arab country was like, hey, how about we recognize you? That they
Well,
beat Israel to the punch.
but I mean, why would they recognize an illegitimate apartheid
Of
regime?
course, right.
Israel had opportunities after 1949 to make peace with its neighbors, and instead they chose to invade Egypt in 1956 and to invade Jordan and Syria and Egypt in 1967, and then to invade Lebanon in 1979 and invade Lebanon
Why
again
did
in
they invade
1982.
Lebanon?
Why did they invade Lebanon?
Yeah, was there something going on in South Lebanon?
Nothing of significance.
Okay.
No, they wanted to invade. I mean,
What was it? So it just wasn't used as a staging ground to have attacks
sure.
by Palestinian Fedayeen? Okay, I mean that's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
crossed
yeah.
over.
There were
Okay,
like there were like a scratch from there.
all right. So today I'm joined by Robert Farrell. We're going to be discussing Israel and Palestine. Um, I take the position of being an Arab. You can call me a Zionist. So I'm the Arab Zionist in this half of the conversation, and I'm really grateful to be joined by Robert, who I hope is going to offer some very strong pushback against my positions. Robert, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Robert Farrell. I'm a physician. I live in Portland, Oregon, and been following this issue for some time. And I think you could accurately characterize me as passionately anti-Zionist.
And
I am not just someone who has criticism of Israel's specific policies. I think that the ideology of Zionism is fundamentally wrong and at a root of a lot of the harms that have come out of it. That everyone can see the horrors that have unfolded in that region over the last 100 years. I think Zionism is not just something that's gone on off track, but it's actually the fundamental root cause of a lot of that.
And we got connected on Substack, where your username is from the river to the sea, right?
I don't know that that's my username. I think it's in my bio.
Let me double check. I think when you click on, I'll probably edit this out, but when you click on, oh, now it's skeptical physician. Okay.
I don't really know how these things work. I was born
Yeah,
in 1974.
yeah, that's fine.
I had to learn
So,
to use Discord the other day.
I mean,
Oh,
congrats. I can't fucking understand Discord. So, uh, to you and I came at this issue from different positions. One, you've read way more about this topic than I have. I admit relative ignorance compared to you. For everyone, everyone should know that when I asked, generally I ask for sources ahead of time to avoid surprises and avoid having to kind of grapple with new insights as we're recording. You sent me like a 51-page bibliography. I admit I didn't go through it. So the you I think you also said you've been reading. You've been interested or like very what's the word? You've been into this issue for several decades, right?
2.5.
Okay, yeah. So for me, and I outlined this in my Substack piece, I didn't know anything about relatively nothing about the conflict. I was ignorant and agnostic on the issue. It's not something I thought about. It wasn't until October 7th that I saw people cheering the massacre, and I thought, I don't understand this. Why are people happy about this? And I wanted to learn more about it, more. And very, very basic research. I don't claim to be an expert. I did a lot of Wikipedia reading. I'm a wiki warrior, and I thought the conflict was relatively clear. The moral clarity was obvious to me. There was, and my stance is generally very much in favor of Israel. To put it more concretely, at this point, I don't think I would support a two-state solution. I think Palestinians should just give up. I think the cause is unjustified. The tactics are not only atrocious but also counterproductive. And there's a lot of running interference from people in the West that try to sane wash a lot of the crazier claims coming from the Palestinian cause. That's just like the summary. I'm sure we're going to get more into it. So I wrote a piece called "The Jewish Conspiracy to Change My Mind," and the goal there was to highlight the process of how I got to that point. And I wrote a follow up, and then most recently, uh, prompted by our upcoming conversation, I wrote something called "Who Controls the Dirt" to
Mhm.
examine the idea of tying ethnicity to land. So we can. There's not going to be that much structure, I guess. We can have it like a free flowing conversation. Several areas I wanted to touch upon that we discussed were talking about the validity of the Palestinian cause, also examining whether or not Israel has a right to exist. Any of those topics I think, are fair game. Any criticism that you can levy upon me and my writing, I'm famished for it. That's something I've been that's been lacking that I wish I had more of.
Mhm.
So, where do you want to start?
Yeah, I don't think you'll be disappointed on that score. Well, I'd like to start with a piece that you reference in, I think, your follow up,
Okay.
where Inverse Florida wrote a piece called Denial by a Thousand Cuts.
Yep.
And you said, this essay helped me understand the dynamics more than any other piece of writing. And it was thoroughly depressing because Inverse makes an airtight argument that I don't want to be true. What is that airtight argument?
So, let me see to get refresh my memory on this. Inverse Florida is an eccentric substacker. I really appreciate them for coining the term sane washing. And they wrote this piece October 15th. I think it was a week after October 7th. And from what I remember, it was how much it was like simultaneously denying the atrocities that Hamas committed, but also justifying them at the same time. And let me see if I remember. I'm just reading up on it real quick.
I mean, this is the essay that helped you understand the dynamics more than any other piece of writing.
Right, but I'm trying to, in terms of like countering, figuring out exactly which argument came from which place. I'm trying to remember
Mhm.
what specifically the space it occupied. Yeah, so it was a combination of one core tenet of leftism is that it needs to be perpetually powerless, um, or at least that's like one of the lore behind the ideology, and the other part is simultaneously like not. Let me see if I remember the best way to like say this. This was something I saw among my friends as well, and it's the the rubric to address criticism on leftist tactics, and I'm including Hamas in this rubric, even though they're I don't know if they're necessarily leftists. Uh, if something is done that is deplorable, there's a reluctance to call it to admit that it was deplorable.
Mhm.
Instead, the trick is to shift the tables, to switch up the tables and say, actually, it's your fault for even noticing that this is bad. And I think that highlights this intractable dissonance where when you show people footage of mass shootings at music festivals, it's really hard to come up with a cogent argument that this is a militarily advantageous tactic. Instead, you either shift the blame to explaining, well, that's not a big deal compared to the atrocities that they're responding to from Israel, or pointing out that why you only, it's not our place to criticize how the oppressed react, and etc. There's a laundry list of responses to that.
But I mean, what's the argument? Is the argument that that's bad?
Which
That
part?
it's I you tell me.
The
I
part
mean, you're saying
that's
this is
bad is
an
denying
airtight
it.
argument. I want to understand it.
The
The
part that's
argument is
bad
that this
is
is a dynamic on the left. Is it particular to the left as compared to the right's willingness to acknowledge when someone on their side does something wrong and call them out on it and apply a strong
no.
objective standard?
It's not a left right. It's not unique to the left. I see it among Trump supporters whenever something embarrassing or bad happens on the right. They're reluctant to admit that it was bad,
Hmm.
and trying to shift the tables or shift the blame to the other side. In fact, I saw this from the Israeli right wing when it was the prime minister that was assassinated in the 90s. He was assassinated.
Rabin,
Who was it?
Yitzhak Rabin.
Itzhak Rabin. He was assassinated by an ultra Orthodox Jew in Israel, and he was. What are you shaking your head about?
Well, he was assassinated by a far right Israeli settler. He wasn't ultra orthodox. That's a different thing. But
My apologies.
regardless,
Uh, he was assassinated by a far right Jewish settler who was upset that Yitzhak Rabin. I guess he had a lot of grievances, but one of the things is that he was upset that he was even engaging in peace talks with the Palestinians,
right.
uh, and there was this embarrassment from the ultra right Israeli community because one of their own shot and killed a relatively popular prime minister in Israel. And so they engaged in this denial. Even the assassin's own mother asked her son, this was during an American Life episode, is it possible? The son was talking about how they got a pistol, they loaded a pistol, they had the pistol on him as he took the train to go to this event where he eventually did shoot and kill Itzhak Rabin. And his
Hmm.
mom stepped in and said, "Isn't it possible that Mossad or some other entity pickpocketed the pistol off of you and like put in blank bullets?" So there was a lot of mental acrobatics
Hmm.
that were taking place to wash blame from wash this kind of like shameful stain on the
Hmm.
community. So the element of denial is not unique to leftism. What was identified here is the the specific type of denial within the in the context of October 7th.
Hmm.
There's this reluctance. I mean, it's kind of a dilemma. Either you say Hamas has the right to resist by any means necessary, at which point you have to eat, you have to, swallow, bite the bullet, and accept all of their tactics, or you criticize them and then you undermine the rubric that some groups are beyond criticism. So
Hmm.
those are the two things in tension, and it's not exclusive to the left.
Okay. So we might say, in a broader sense, that humans are kind of shitty and they have a tendency, when they strongly identify with a position, to vilify the other side and justify or elude the embarrassing or wicked or evil things that the people that they empathize or identify with do.
Yes,
Sure. Okay. Well, let's look at that a little bit. Do you remember what the primary example in verse Florida gave of the denial of Hamas atrocities, the leftist denial?
no,
So it was the idea that there were not 40 beheaded babies on
oh yeah,
October 7th.
yeah, I
Yeah.
remember that one.
They said that there was absolutely overwhelming evidence of this, to such an extent.
Wait, who said what?
Let's see.
I wasn't asking for the specific, but when you
Yeah.
said they said there was
The
overwhelming
author.
evidence. Oh,
Is this a male identifying person?
I think they're trans. I don't know their
Yeah.
gender identity.
That's why I just went with they. The author said that there was overwhelming evidence of this from CBS's firsthand eyewitness reports, the Jerusalem Post, pictures on Twitter posted by the Israeli government. We've had all kinds of confirmations, enough that any normal person, you'd think, wouldn't so confidently say the baby beheadings are misinformation. This is something that the author thought was so overwhelmingly obvious that a large part of the rest of the piece is taken up in an analysis of the pathology of the people who would deny it. Would you
I
say
think
that's
there's
a
two.
reasonable
There's
description?
a distinction here. I didn't read that as Inverse Florida claiming that there is absolute proof that 40 babies were indeed beheaded. I think there's just enough evidence, enough corroboration to at least prevent someone from just flatly denying that it's untrue. My own position is I don't think there were, I don't know if there were 40 babies beheaded. I also think it's an irrelevant hill to die on. But I do recall how that became, I guess, like a mantra talking point where leftists were saying, "Oh, this was a debunked point." So clearly, the
Mhm.
implication being is that clearly the Zionists are lying about everything else. I saw the same thing happen with rapes, uh, alleged rapes during October 7th, where that was a point that was vociferously contested. Where
Right. And a number of those stories were conclusively debunked.
I don't. I'm not ready to accept that. But even if there were, I also don't think that's irrelevant. I don't think that's relevant because whether one specific allegation of rape was conclusively debunked doesn't mean that there were no rapes on October 7th.
No, it certainly doesn't. But wouldn't you say that it has? an impact on the credibility of people who are telling you about other atrocities without offering evidence?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like
If someone
if
has
you have
a
like you're a
core,
lawyer, right?
yes,
I read that in some of your pieces. If you have a witness that says, you know, Arthur killed Jane and Arthur raped Susan
right.
and
This is
Arthur
not
killed,
like
you know, like
I'm not gonna fight you on this.
right.
It's I
It
think it's
speaks
an
to the credibility overall.
I
Doesn't
think
mean that
the
nothing.
credibility attaches to specific people and specific organizations. It might attach to broader movements, but I think it's a weaker attachment because it's unfair to tarnish someone's credibility just because someone else that happens to share their political views lied about something. There is like a gradient. There is a nexus involved there. If there's a movement, the example that comes up to me is the 2020 elections, where there's a bunch of charlatans and grifters, and I think it's
Mhm,
reasonable to be skeptical of any new claims about that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump.
mhm.
But I think it's still important to compartmentalize it and assign credibility as narrowly as practical.
Right. So one might say, for example, that if some of the voices on the left in the United States use shitty arguments to defend Hamas and advocate for the Palestinians, that does not necessarily reflect on the validity of Hamas's goals and methods or the goals of the Palestinian national movement.
Yes, there is some nexus to it, but yes, you should assign blame where it lies. You shouldn't just tarnish by association. Not
No, I
necessarily. There's
completely agree. But the overwhelming bulk of the evidence of atrocities on October 7th is under the control and custodianship of the Israeli government. So when official representatives of the Israeli government spread these debunked atrocity stories,
which which debunk the atrocity stories.
well, the beheaded babies are a good example. There's absolutely no evidence of
What's
that.
the actual affirmative claim that is being debunked?
The claim that
So
40 babies were beheaded on
okay, so
October 7th, that
I want to
that
try
they
and narrow
found
down.
a group of 40 babies that had been beheaded.
Were babies killed on October 7th?
Two,
Two
counting
babies
a
were killed
two-year-old as a baby.
out of 1,200. Okay, well, let me start. What's the like death toll of Israelis on October 7th?
Was between it was between 1100 and 1200.
Okay, and out of those, two babies were confirmed killed.
Maybe a baby and an infant, and also a pregnant woman was killed.
Okay, I don't know what the actual death toll of babies. I'm but go on.
So there has not been any affirmative evidence that any babies were beheaded, but the specific claim, which was made by a rescue worker, that he saw the bodies of 40 babies that have been beheaded, I think that that has been exhaustively debunked. And of course, you
How
can't prove a negative. Well, the fact that 40 babies didn't die, period, that there's no photographic evidence, that no other witnesses have come forward, that none of the presumably 80 parents of these babies have, you know, come forward to say that their child was beheaded. Just like, what's the evidence? Because of course you can't prove a negative. Like, if
right?
you want
So
to defend this idea that babies were beheaded, I would
so
ask you, where did that happen? Who did it
I
happen to?
sure I this was not an issue that I remember how much it was discussed, but this wasn't an issue that I cared about because I didn't see the relevance. I saw it as I mean, I guess I'll provide the general my overall sentiments about this. Uh, there was a massacre that happened. People were still picking up the pieces, trying to figure out what exactly transpired. Uh, within that context, it's not unexpected. It's not unreasonable for rumors to spread, for allegations to circulate without corroboration. So even if I stipulate that the 40 beheaded babies was false, that doesn't change anything. That doesn't really update anything about my overall impression. And the converse is, uh, I saw this as a cudgel where, aha, like 40 babies were not beheaded, therefore there you have to kind of like read between the lines. There's like a strong version where you say, therefore, we should be skeptical of any other claims made by Israeli affiliated rescue workers. And then the weaker claim, or like the less defensible one, is therefore the Zionists are lying about everything, like they always do.
And I
So
think that would be the stronger claim if you're
yeah, that's
speaking.
not the I didn't name it properly, but I mean like the less
Yeah,
there's like a
yeah,
defensible position and the less defensible position.
yeah,
So
but
I just
that's
didn't
way
see
up at
what
50,000 feet. And I would like to stay with this essay that you said was shaped your view on this more than anything else. I didn't
right,
put beheaded
but
babies at the
beheaded
center of my
babies,
claims.
but the
Encourage
beheaded babies
Florida to put it
are not
at the
load
center of their
bearing.
claim.
Sorry, I'm talking over you, but the beheaded babies aspect is not a load bearing aspect to the overall argument.
It's not. They're saying that progressives are delusional and in denial about Hamas's atrocities. What other examples did they give um, of leftists being in denial about Hamas's atrocities?
I have to go through it again. I haven't read this article in a long time.
I mean, I think that was the key example. And then they move on to saying how the leftists think that they're powerless, which I think is a misunderstanding of trying to stand with people who are marginalized. Um, but that's the example that Inverse Florida gives, and it's exactly wrong. They're in denial about the veracity of this story, which has fallen apart and had to be walked back.
So, I mean, they're responding to a post on October 12th.
Right?
You would say that it was conclusively debunked at that point?
I would say that there was no good evidence for it at that point.
But that's not the same thing as saying it didn't happen.
Well, who's saying it didn't happen?
I mean, some random Twitter user.
Where? Let's see. Now the fucking president is repeating made up shit about beheaded babies.
Right.
But it was made up shit about beheaded babies.
They
So they
even
were
if I
correct.
stipulate that it was made up shit, that information wasn't available at the time. That post was on October 12th, and on October 11th, CBS had an article that interviewed an eyewitness account about it.
Right, but this article is still up. It's
Okay, but
been more than a
you're
year.
making different claims here, and I want to make sure that that's very clear. CBS comes out with a firsthand eyewitness report on October 11th.
Right.
October 12th,
That
there
was
wasn't enough
wrong.
information. That wasn't, even if I stipulate that it was wrong, that wasn't known at the time. So claiming on October 12th that this is debunked, that is, even if I stipulate that it was a false claim that ended up being uncovered afterwards, claiming that it was debunked the day after that news report, that's not a defensible position.
Well, they
That's
didn't
too
say it was debunked. They said it was made up shit, which it
right,
was.
made up shit, but they didn't know that at the time.
That
What
seems to leave a
information?
lot resting. Like here is somebody who made an inference from the available information, which was correct, and then that becomes the tent pole for the argument that the left is in denial about Hamas's atrocities.
Right. If even if this person ended up being correct afterwards, they found out information afterwards that corroborated their belief. That is a premature belief to broadcast. So at that point, you're
But
familiar with the phrase
they're not calling
accidentally
it
right?
premature. They're calling it denial of a absolutely proven, established fact.
This was this was a claim posted on October 12th that saying that it was made up shit. How did they know that it was made up shit?
I think we would have to ask them. And I think it's difficult
Okay.
to reconstruct exactly what they knew at the time.
I mean
What
that,
we
but this would
know
be
is
an
that they were
example of
correct.
this would be an example of I mean, it's just cognitive dissonance where you're preemptively saying, obviously this is bullshit. I don't know why it's bullshit. I'm not going to give you a reason. It's
I
not
mean,
like it
it's
was like
Twitter,
another
right?
report.
It's one particular Twitter post. So we don't know if this discussion continued and they gave sources and reasons why they thought it was made up shit.
Sure.
Um,
Claiming that on October 12th that this was made up shit, that would be, in my opinion, an indefensible position. You can't claim that something is made up shit when reporting is still ongoing.
right, but you also can't claim that it is absolutely proven and other people are in denial, particularly when you're wrong.
That's not. I think you're misconstruing the argument.
Mm,
Uh, Even if
but I
the
am.
overall claim ends up being correct, you can still criticize someone for prematurely claiming that it's made up shit.
Yeah, but this is an article that is still up. Do you think that maybe they could have put a note on it that says, as it turned out, babies weren't beheaded?
I mean,
That
you
this
can
was
message
a
them and ask them to
story that
update it.
Israel spread around the world to
No,
justify their
because
killing of tens of thousands of children?
the point is this person is jumping to conclusions and saying it's made up shit prematurely.
Mm.
They're making a claim a day after there's a CBS article with firsthand eyewitness report. At that point, I think the only defensible position at that point is to say, I don't know. Maybe it's true, maybe it's
Right, but
not.
what but
Here's
that's not
reasons
the
to
position
believe it.
that Inverse Florida is taking. They're not taking the
They're
position that they don't know.
criticizing someone. They're
They're taking
criticizing
the
someone
position that it's
prematurely.
absolutely a proven fact.
They're criticizing some. The criticism here is prematurely reaching a conclusion.
The words premature do not occur anywhere in this article.
Okay.
That this is somebody who is saying it is a proven fact that babies were beheaded, such that I want to analyze the psychological dysfunction and the pathology of people who deny this, people who are basically the equivalent of flat earthers.
I mean, I'm gonna
That's
read
the
what
claim.
Inverse Florida said. I didn't want this to be like a half hour or like an hour conversation on just beheaded babies.
No, I mean
I'm gonna
we
read
can certainly move on
exactly.
from this. I think it's interesting because you cited this as a very, very
Yes,
influential part of shaping your views on it.
right. But the
And
beheaded babies was
the
not followed by
central
the
claim
massacre.
here is wrong. The central claim here is that people were in denial about the obvious and exhaustively proven fact that dozens of babies were beheaded.
So I'm gonna read what Inverse Florida said so that their position is not misconstrued. Um, on October 11th, that's when the CBS article came out. Since October 11th, this was posted on October 15th, so within a few days. Uh, since then, we've also had the Jerusalem Post, had pictures on Twitter posted by the Israeli government. We had all kinds of confirmations, enough that any normal person, you'd think, wouldn't so confidently say the baby beheadings are misinformation and perhaps have at least a little bit of doubt. I stand by that. I think there's nothing wrong with that argument. They're claiming that you don't have enough information to confidently say that this is misinformation at that time. And we're talking about a 4-day period of time from October 11th to October 15th.
I mean, I think that you're saying watching this argument, but I think you're right. I think we're in the weeds
I'm
about
reading
it.
exactly what Inverse Florida said.
No, and I read the same sentence to you not 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, any
What
normal
pictures were
person
posted
wouldn't
on
so
Twitter by the
confidently
Israeli
say,
government? Like, there were no pictures of beheaded babies posted by the Israeli government on Twitter. That
uh,
never
yeah,
happened.
yeah, like the point
It's
here is
made
that
up
any normal person wouldn't so confidently say that this is information and perhaps
based
have a little
based
at
on
least.
these photographs that do not exist.
Okay, I'm just gonna keep reading what Inverse Florida is saying. There
I hear
wasn't
what
enough
you're saying.
information at that time to claim confidently that this is misinformation. I think that's accurate.
Well, this sentence though says that there's positive proof that the pictures posted by the Israeli government, for example, have you seen those pictures?
No, it doesn't matter. I'm gonna
Well,
ask
it
you.
doesn't matter
Here's
that
the
they're wrong.
question.
It doesn't matter that they are saying you're in denial when someone is telling them what is factually true.
Here's the question I would pose. On October 12th, Do you think you would there was enough information to confidently say that this is misinformation?
It's hard to go back that far.
Okay,
I
but
mean, I think,
that's the
yeah, I
point.
do. I do think that there was enough information there because if you apply the slightest bit of common sense to this, why are there 40 babies in one place anyway? Do you think that Hamas is going out and gathering babies and then bringing them to a central location and then beheading 40 of them? Even if it's a daycare, you don't have 40 babies in it.
I mean,
Yeah, I think that that story smelled to high heaven from the first moment that it
so
came
but
out.
you would confidently say that it's misinformation.
I don't know. I mean, I
Okay,
can't go that far back in time.
that's
I
the point. That's the point here. It's what information, the information you had at the time, what assertions can you actually make? Because right now you're expressing skepticism. I don't think there's anything wrong with skepticism. If you say this is a wild story, I'm not sure I want to believe it. How do you get 40 babies in one location? That's fine. I think that's a defensible skepticism. But this person said this is made up shit. And they did this October 12th when reporting was still ongoing. So that's the point
where
here.
do you see a timestamp of October 12th?
That was the paragraph to, it says this post was on October 12th.
Okay, so that's the claim.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. The post is not titled people jumping to conclusions or people inappropriately confident or people who do not have enough epistemistic humility. It is called denial. I
Right.
mean,
And I mean, this is an example of denial. You don't have enough information to confidently say that it's made up shit.
well, no. It's an example of denial a year after an atrocity has been debunked to still have an essay up claiming that it is an overwhelmingly established fact. That is denial.
I'm not sure how else to. I think we should move on because I don't know how else to articulate it.
I think that's I
Inverse
think
Florida is not claiming that this is established fact. That's not central to their argument. They're claiming at the time on October 12th, you did not have enough information to claim that this is misinformation. That's what I read from the.
nowhere do they say on October 12th you didn't have enough information. They say this is the fact and you're in denial about it.
No. Okay. I I'm just gonna like put this on the screen and people can interpret it however they want. Was there anything else you wanted to address in Inverse Florida
Well, I
essay?
mean, I think we could go deeper into it, but I think we've kind of, gotten tangled up at the first hurdle and we don't want, as you say, we don't want to spend the entire conversation on this. Um yeah, let's talk about something else. Let's have fun. I have fun. I have trivia, I have games. I got the whole thing.
Okay,
So, you want to play a game? It's a little bit of a palate cleanse.
sure.
Okay. I call this game Where Are They Now? I'm going to
Okay,
give you a person who was involved in an important event or series of events. And I want you to tell me either what was their next job or their last job or the job they were best known for. Right.
okay,
And I am going to start with an easy one that I know from your writing that you know the answer to, just to kind of show how the game works. So in uh, Mandate Palestine, there was a terrorist group, and I feel very comfortable calling it a terrorist group because they called themselves terrorists. And the leader of this group was a man named Yitzhak Shamir. And he was their leader when they did things like assassinate the UN mediator who was trying to mediate peace and carried out various massacres, atrocities, killed police, killed unarmed Palestinians.
do you want me to
What
give
was
the
his
answer?
what was his next job?
You're talking about Yitzhak Shamir. He was the leader
Mhm.
of the Stern Gang.
Mhm.
He became prime minister of Israel in 1986.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is an interesting statement about Israeli culture, don't you think?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can frame it different ways. The Let me see. You can. I would say that Israeli culture is comfortable with having leaders that were involved in some sort of violence. That also applies to Menachem Begin. He was the leader of the Orgun. He was the one responsible for the King David hotel bombing. He was elected prime minister in 1977. And the same thing happened to Ariel Sharon. He was elected prime minister in 2001. And Sharon wasn't part of the original Zionist terrorist groups. But the things he did in Lebanon, we can spend hours talking about.
Or before that,
Yeah.
with Unit
Full history.
101 and the retaliation operations in Jordan. There was one in particular, a village called Quana, where he and Unit 101 killed 69 civilians in one attack, one terrorist attack.
Was this like a false flag operation?
No,
Maybe
no,
I'm
we
thinking of
can
something.
we can get to that and talk about the Lavin affair and the bombings of Israeli synagogues in Iraq. But this was not a false flag. This was a very
No, I'm
simple
saying
revenge operation.
I'm not claiming that it was a. I'm saying that I think Sharon. I don't know if I'm thinking of Sharon, but someone uh, created a false flag operation to justify an invasion. I don't remember if it was which country it was.
Yeah, I think that happened to Lebanon a couple of times, but this was smaller scale than that. These
Yeah.
were operations where something happened inside Israel that Israelis didn't like a Palestinian came back and shot somebody, and they would pick a village in Jordan that was adjacent to where they thought this Palestinian would come into the country, and they would just go and murder a few dozen people there. This is a simple revenge sort of a thing.
So you saw that I wrote about all three of these people, right?
Yeah, that's why I
Okay.
started with those because I wanted you to understand how the game works. So in 1912, a prominent rabbi was doing a question and answer setting online. And I'm sorry, I'm looking for his name here. I'm getting in trouble because I broke this into two pieces. Uh, and in that, he was asked about rape. And he said that although intercourse with a female Gentile is very grave, it is permitted during wartime out of consideration for the soldiers' difficulties. And since the success of the collective in the war, the Torah permitted soldiers to satisfy the evil urge under the condition it stipulated for the sake of the collective success. So this was Rabbi Krim in uh, 2012. It is permitted to breach the
You
walls
said
of modesty and
1912 earlier.
no 2012.
Okay.
I'm sorry. um, It is permitted to breach the walls of modesty and satisfy the evil inclination by lying with attractive Gentile women against their will.
Okay.
What was his next job?
I don't know.
He is currently the chief rabbi of the Israeli Defense Forces.
Okay.
This guy, who is best known for making an argument that it's okay for Israeli soldiers to rape women in wartime, is now the primary spiritual leader of the Jews in the Israeli Defense Forces. I
Okay.
think that
That's
one is
fucked up.
really funny. Are you familiar with the Quibia massacre?
I don't think so. It doesn't come. Doesn't sound familiar.
So, the Israelis kind of are like a band who has one big hit, and their big hit was the Nakba, where they succeeded in ethnically cleansing about 700,000 Palestinians. And, just like a band with a big hit, they have tried to reproduce that experience with limited additional success. And one example of this was in 1956 when they invaded the Sinai. And one of the generals said it would be advantageous for you to go into these villages on the border and kill some Palestinians because that would hopefully encourage the flight of others out of the state of Israel and into Jordan.
Okay.
And 2 out of 3 of the unit commanders who got this order said that that's illegal and wrong, and I'm not going to do it. And one of them was like, "Yes, sir." Oh, where's the Quibia massacre? So, what they did on the morning of the invasion of the Sinai by Israel in 1956, they um, established a curfew for all the Palestinians. They all had to be in their homes by noon. Well, the trouble was, of course, that people were already out in the fields working when this curfew was laid down, and they had absolutely no way to know about the curfew. So, as people came back after 5 o'clock from the days of working in the field, this army unit just shot them, killed them, murdered them.
Okay.
And among the dead were like 14 children. There's a disagreement about whether 52 people died or 53 died because, again, one of the people who was murdered was a pregnant woman. So you can kind of make your own determinations about that. Uh,
I mean, I don't know if this is a spoiler, but I don't think rape is justified. I condemn any defense of any attempt to defend wartime rape. I don't like civilian massacres, and I condemn anyone that advocates for it or engages in it.
sure. Yeah, I would expect no less. But you've said that culture is an important part of how you regard this, and that your
Sure.
primary reason for wanting Israel to continue to dominate the Palestinians is that you believe that they have a superior culture, a
Overall, yes.
superior state, more wealth, a better rule of law. Um, you know,
Yes.
that Palestinians would be better off under this regime. And I think you've also called Israel an open and cosmopolitan society. And
Comparatively speaking, yes.
I think that in that light, it is interesting to look at that society and the kind of things that it does and the kind of things that it justifies and elevates. For example, it wasn't
Sure.
just Yitzhak Shamir who became prime minister. They gave medals to all the surviving members of the Stern Gang in the 1980s. They gave them awards. They were given this gesture of heroism,
Yeah,
um,
it's bad to
officially recognized by the
celebrate
state.
any members of the Stern Gang or any terrorist. I'm
Mhm.
comfortable making that claim. That
Okay.
doesn't change. That doesn't change my position.
No, I'm not trying to change your position, and I think that that's a false goal. I
Well,
think that no matter what I say, no matter what argument I make, no matter what facts I bring to light, you're not going to change your entire outlook in one go.
I
Like
should
that
say,
there are always gonna
even
be other things supporting your position.
right,
So I
even
think
if you don't change my position, or even if that's not your goal, I'm saying that's not a contradiction in my position. I'm, like a more tepid goal, more realistic, is just for you to highlight contradictions in my positions. I don't think that's a contradiction because I can condemn aspects of cultures that I don't like, and I can praise aspects of cultures that I do like, and then I can make a generalized assessment based off of the accumulation of all the tiny aspects of it.
right, and
Culture is a
that's what you've
complicated
done with
thing.
the Palestinians.
I'm sorry.
That's what you've done with the Palestinians.
Yeah, that's one aspect. Yes.
Okay. Well, tell me about that. What are some aspects of Palestinian culture that you like?
I'm trying to think of what is uniquely Palestinian. that I would find praiseworthy. And I don't know. I can't think of anything that is uniquely Palestinian that I would want to commend.
What are some of your favorite Palestinian authors?
None. I don't know
None?
any.
So
No, I don't know any.
you've come to an overall judgment about this culture, but you haven't read any books by Palestinians.
Correct, because the overriding presence that they have is militant. It's the militant aspect of it.
When you say it's the
That's what's at the
overriding
forefront.
presence, aren't you literally saying that I'm taking these negative aspects of the culture and I'm using them to pass judgment on it?
No, I'm saying I'm looking what is distinct about Palestinian culture. What differentiates it the most from other cultures? Because we're not just talking about Arab culture or Middle Eastern culture. We're talking about Palestinian culture
Right?
specifically. And I'm trying to figure out like what differentiates it. Because I can't just say, oh, I like hummus or I like the olives that they grow, because
Well, what
everyone
about
does
some
that.
Palestinian artists?
It's not going to change my opinion on the overall assessment because the most prominent aspect, the most distinguishing aspect of Palestinian culture is militarism.
It's the most prominent and distinguished aspect, or it's just the only aspect that you've ever paid any attention to?
I mean, it could be both. You can highlight any omissions that I've had, but
Well, this is what
what
I'm saying.
is
You haven't read any books by Palestinians. You haven't
it's not going
read.
to change my opinion when there's a Wikipedia page on like the use of child suicide bombers by Palestinian groups like
Let's talk
that.
about that. In one of your pieces, you say that the security barriers in the West Bank have to be understood in the context of the threat of 14-year-old Palestinian suicide bombers.
Yes,
Okay, that sounds really bad. How many 14-year-old suicide bombers have there been?
I don't know exactly how many.
Ballpark figure.
Less than 10.
How much less?
I just gave you asked for a ballpark. That's my ballpark. Less than
Well, yeah.
10. I don't
So,
know how many.
do you know any of their names?
No,
Who did they attack?
the checkpoints. I don't even know if they had any successful attacks.
Okay. But you know that they did have attacks or
I think
thwarted
it was
attacks.
attempted attacks.
Attempted attacks. Okay.
Right.
Where was this attempted attack? Or where were they captured or surrendered to authorities?
I don't know. Do you want to just skip to the end of the line of questioning?
Well, I just want to understand because there's never been a 14-year-old Palestinian suicide bomber. That is another thing
You
that didn't
mean
happen like
not
the
not
Israeli Sarah
successful?
Davis. No, not even attempted. Didn't happen. It's
Okay,
a
what's
propaganda lie.
which one? Which lie is it? Okay, tell me more. How was it misconstrued or how was it fabricated?
Well, I mean, obviously, given the fact that you've just accepted this and made it part of your worldview, like Israeli propagandists, they don't have to work very hard. They have a fertile soil in which they can say, well, these fanatical Palestinians, they send 14-year-old children to blow themselves up at checkpoints.
Okay.
And there's not um, a testing of that because it feels right. It's congruent with your overall assessment of Palestinian culture.
So what's the affirmative claim that you're like making that Palestinian groups have never used anyone under the age of 18 to carry out a suicide attempt,
No,
a
that's a
suicide
different
bomb?
claim. I'm saying that your claim that they've used a 14-year-old suicide bomber is false.
Okay, let's go into this claim.
Yeah, let's.
Okay, which one is false?
The claim that Palestinians have used a 14-year-old suicide bomber. Any of the Palestinian militant organizations at any time.
Okay, so I'm just like at the Wikipedia page. the one that's titled "The Use of Child Suicide Bombers by Palestinian Militant Groups."
Hmm.
I'm going down the list. Uh, there's one from 2004 where Abdullah Quran, a 12-year-old, was captured with a bomb in his bag. So what's the claim? That it wasn't a bomb, that it wasn't in his bag, that he wasn't 12. What are you contesting?
Let's see. Minors were sometimes used as messengers and couriers, and according to Israeli sources, as fighters. However, no evidence was found of systemic recruitment of children by Palestinian armed groups.
So I'm
Okay, so now
going
we have
back
a
to
section.
the case of Abdullah Quran. He's a
I'm
12
getting
year
there.
old.
I'm getting there. Let's see. Suicide bombings by minors. The main Palestinian militant groups have publicly stated their opposition to the use of children in suicide attacks. Let's see. There were 9 documented suicide bombings against Israeli soldiers and civilians involving Palestinian minors. No evidence of systemic recruitment. A 16-year-old child was involved in a suicide attack where the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine admitted it made a mistake and vowed to improve its age checking procedures.
So which part is false? Which part of my claim is false?
Well,
Because you keep
where are
using
you seeing a 12-year-old?
I just like Control F Abdullah Quran.
So there's no Wikipedia page for Abdullah Quran.
Correct.
So I don't know the circumstances, but the fact that you're transporting a bomb does not mean that you're a suicide bomber. In fact, it'd be kind of weird because it's typically like suicide belts, right?
Okay. All right.
No, I'm just trying to understand. Like, there has never been a suicide bombing by a 14-year-old. And
Right.
in
I
fact,
know,
if you
but
read a little
you're
further in that thing,
I'm
it
very
will.
cognizant of the the vocabulary pirouette you're attempting here. I'm not. It's not. I'm not blind to it. I claim that Palestinian groups have used children, have recruited children,
But
and
you
they've
specifically said 14-year-olds.
yes. So on Zencaster, you can see a chat. There's a statement from Amnesty International. This is in 2005.
Hmm.
On 22nd May 2005, a 15-year-old Palestinian child carrying an explosive was arrested by an Israeli army at the Huwara military checkpoint at the entrance to the West Bank town of Nablus. This is the third such incident this year in which Palestinian children have been arrested at Israeli military checkpoints while carrying explosives or munitions. So,
Right. So
what?
they're carrying explosives and munitions. That doesn't make them suicide bombers. Like, all organizations who are insurgents are going to be moving around explosives. And you can see the temptation to use a child to do that.
Yeah, that's fucked up. Uh,
I
I
agree.
I don't see any reason to. I, we went from you saying that this is completely fabricated, it's not true,
It
to
isn't.
you walking it back and saying, well, there's no systemic use of children by
No, I
Palestinian
mean, it
groups.
isn't. There isn't a 14-year-old suicide bomber. You have
Right.
still not shown me a 14-year-old.
There's no sex. I'll grant you that. I'll concede this. There's no
Right.
successful detonation by a 14-year-old.
Is there
Okay.
can you show me an attempted detonation? Can you show me a 14-year-old whose suicide belt didn't go off?
No, I don't think they managed to even get to that point.
Okay.
They're not screening for high competence teenagers.
So this person, that's really interesting. So they're suicide bombers, even though they never committed a suicide bombing, never
I didn't
attempted a
claim.
suicide bombing, never were found planning a suicide bombing. But you feel strongly because a very small number of children have been found trying to smuggle explosives through a checkpoint that child suicide bombers are like a thing.
They tried to make him a thing, sure.
But where's the evidence that they tried to make him a thing? I mean, they're
Okay,
saying
so I'll
it's
go
not a
through it.
thing, that they don't
There
want
is
to do this.
there is obviously no aversion to using suicide bombings by Palestinian groups. I think we
No?
grant
Then
that.
why are we talking about
There's
2005?
there's no aversion to using women to carry out suicide bombing attacks, especially because they get less scrutiny from Israeli security. There's a widespread culture of indoctrination among Palestinian groups that teach children how to kill the Yahud, that they should stab them, that they should kill them. There's trading cards that they pass out to glorify the martyrs. This is like part of the
Okay,
culture. This is a
we're
widespread
bordering on a
culture of
Gish Gallop
glorification.
here. You
I'm
just
not
made
done.
like a
There's a
half a dozen
widespread
different
culture of
claims.
glorification of martyrdom within the
Right.
society.
Right, they're
There's
glorifying people
children.
fighting
I'm not
back.
done. I'm not done. There's children that
No,
have
but
been
you're
caught.
doing a Gish Gallop.
There's
You're making
I'm
way
not.
too many
You're
claims for us to
welcome.
examine.
It's not going to be a gishgalop if you can rebut each one.
No, that's
There's
not how a Gish Gallop works, man. How can I possibly repeat all those points? I can't even remember all of them. Pick
okay.
one. Pick
All right.
one and
Let me
let's
finish.
talk about it and chase it
Okay.
down.
This is the let me finish. There's children that are caught at security checkpoints with explosives. I think
Okay.
that's enough evidence to showcase that there's at least an attempt to recruit children to become suicide bombers. So I outlined all the factors that
Okay.
contribute to that.
And so for a society to use children to fight wars is, to you, a prima facie case of a dysfunction or a sickness in that society.
There would need to be a really, really, really good reason for that to be justified. I'm not saying it's impossible. I just can't think of one.
So for you, occupation is not a good reason.
No, not
Okay.
not this type of occupation.
Okay. Who was the youngest person to fight in World War II for the United States?
I don't know. I'm sure it was very young.
It was a 12-year-old.
Okay.
Does that affect your feelings about the United States and its culture?
No.
Why not? They use child soldiers.
um, so was the child like recruited or drafted into it? Did they know that
But
he
you
was
see,
12?
that's the question. You're claiming that these people were recruited
Yeah.
because they were found carrying out militant activities. You said that if someone is found carrying out violent actions, that we can assume that there's a program to recruit them.
No, that's what you were calling the Gish Gallop. I was outlining the different factors that go into my assessment. So I outlined the use of suicide bombers, period. The use of female suicide bombers specifically to evade scrutiny. The third factor is the widespread culture of indoctrination, both in television and UNRWA schools, that glorify violence against the Jews aimed at children. And then the fourth factor is the overall glorification of martyrs, as evidenced by the trading cards that they circulate, the
Right.
posters that they put up. So I outlined four factors. That's not a Gish Gallop. I outlined four factors that contribute to the overall assessment that I'm making.
Which is that
Palestinian
there have
culture is
been
very comfortable
14-year-old
with.
Palestinian suicide bombers.
Sorry, repeat that.
Which is that there have been 14-year-old Palestinian suicide bombers.
Attempted suicide bombers, yes. And I'm outlining all the evidence that supports my claim. So there's the four factors about culture, and also the fact that they were found with explosives at checkpoints. That's enough for me to make that assessment.
Were these explosives ready to be detonated?
I don't give a shit. like,
You
like
don't.
I'm outlining like all the evidence in support of this,
But
in support of my
those things don't support it. The existence of trading cards doesn't support child suicide bombers.
the
Like,
existence
the
of
existence of child suicide bombers supports the existence of child suicide bombers. So, there's no evidence of that because it's not a thing. Like, there are a
Well,
very small number of minors that have been involved in suicide attacks, no 14-year-olds. The youngest that I know of was 16, and
I'm
the
not even
factions
sure
have
what
said that
your
this was a
position is.
mistake.
So I'm not even sure what you're arguing for. I'm claiming that this is an aspect of Palestinian culture, the glorification of martyrdom that also
Right.
seeps into recruiting children to carry out attacks.
What is martyrdom?
Killing yourself in furtherance of a cause that you believe is righteous.
Okay. So, you must have a hard time on Memorial Day
Why? Maybe.
because, like, 250,000 Americans killed themselves in a cause that they thought was righteous, and we have set aside a day on the calendar to praise them.
Yeah.
Is that something that offends you about American culture?
No, because you always have to you evaluate the martyrdom cause depending on how righteous it is. I don't think this is righteous, and I don't think the aspects that I object to is their overall objective. I don't support, and
Right.
then also the tactics that they use are atrocious and counterproductive. So those are the three tenets that I use to criticize.
And I think we should certainly talk about those tenets. I want to talk about those other points, but I want to talk about martyrdom. Um
But okay,
martyr
before we move on, like which I want to understand which aspect of culture the assessment that I made, which one do you actually object to? Do you disagree that suicide bombings have been used? I want to know like where we actually agree.
So, yeah, suicide attacks have been used.
Okay, and you understand, and you also agree that women have been recruited, and
Sure.
it's plausible to
Yeah.
surmise that that was used to evade security checkpoints scrutiny.
Well, I mean, that's a plausible inference, but it's
Okay,
certainly not something that's proven.
I'm
So,
assuming
I
you're
mean,
also
given how morally offensive this is, I'm presuming that no women serve in combat roles in the Israeli army.
no, that's not the point.
Oh, they do? They recruit women to kill Palestinians?
I don't have a problem with women being in combat. I also
Okay,
don't
then
have
why do you have a problem with
necessarily
women in Palestinian militant groups?
because I'm outlining the aspects that I find detestable. The parts that I find detestable is using a vulnerable population specifically to evade scrutiny in order to carry out suicide bombing attacks. I don't like suicide bombing attacks, not necessarily because the person is killed. I think in some instances you can justify a suicide attack if you specifically target an apparatus. And I'll give you uh, uh, a claim. I can't remember the exact one, but I think it was in the CIA. There was an agent in this is in Afghanistan where someone walked into a drone base in Afghanistan and blew themselves up. I
Mhm.
think that's a justifiable attack from the standpoint of you have a problem with the military apparatus. You're targeting aspects of the military apparatus. I think that's fair game. So I'm
Sure.
not criticizing just the suicidality of it.
Right.
I'm making a broader claim just that. And then the third aspect is I'm assuming you're familiar with Tomorrow's Pioneers, the television show from
No,
Hamas, Far Forward the
no.
Mouse.
Oh, I have seen some propaganda about that and how terrible and awful it is. I haven't dug too deep into it because the translations have been from MIRI, which is a Israeli right wing organization that is known to use misleading and false translations to vilify various sources. They take advantage of the fact that not a lot of people speak Arabic, and they've been
Okay,
caught
I mean
doing that several
if you
times.
can point to specific mistranslations,
Oh, sure.
I'm my Arabic is pretty bad, but I'm passably
Yeah.
familiar enough to understand tidbits of it.
So
I didn't see anything.
what is it about this show?
It's a show that targets children, or at least it's aimed for an audience of children
Okay.
that glorify the merits of martyrdom.
طيب شو حابة تشاركينا؟ شو حابة تنشدي لنا؟
لما نستشهد نشوف.
تفضلي.
يلا حيوها تزكوا معها. يلا وهي تنشد ايوه.
يلا.
يلا.
لا 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 لما نستشهد من روح الجنة، لما نستشهد من روح الجنة، لا تقول علينا صغار، من هالعيشة نكبر، من غير فلسطين شو يعني طفولة، من غير فلسطين شو يعني طفولة، لو يعطونا الدنيا وما لا متنسينا لا دو ذنبي كرمالا.
Okay.
I think that's bad. I don't think you should teach children to blow themselves
Right.
up.
You shouldn't teach children to fight in a national struggle. That's wrong.
Yeah,
Okay.
and specifically especially
Google
when the national
Google
struggle is
Israeli
is
Defensive Forces Halloween costume.
yeah. I think any target, you're not going to catch me on this. Like any targeting of children, where you glorify violence, where you glorify the military, I think that's bad. I think it's
Yeah.
even worse when the tactics used are uh, atrocious and also backfire. So that magnifies the criticism that
So
I have.
when you talk about backfiring, you get into this concept of orthogonal violence, which I definitely want to talk to it. But I want to go back to this question of martyrdom, because I think we're talking past each other a little bit. My view of this discourse is that it is an unfortunate human characteristic to glorify people who fight and die for the group. And it is a normal human characteristic to gloss over or deny the horrible, evil, indefensible aspects of that fighting and focus on the fact that the person fought and laid down their lives for that group. This is not something that is unique to Palestinians. I think I sent you the article about how the Gaza war took over online dating and how people who fought in the Gaza war described having a lot of sex and being in great demand from the Israeli women who were fawning all over them.
I haven't
And
read
there
that
were
article, but
also
that
stories in
seems
there
perfectly
about
plausible to me.
premature babies who were forced to be abandoned in a hospital where the Israeli forces made all the doctors leave, and they said these premature babies literally cannot be moved, so you have got to take care of them. And the Israeli authorities accepted that message. And then weeks later, when Palestinians made it back into the hospital, they found the decomposing bodies of those premature babies.
Okay,
And
that's bad.
that night, there are Israeli soldiers that got laid on the
Yeah,
strength of what they were doing in Gaza. And it seems to me at that point, you either have to talk about a very deep pathology in Israeli culture where they are glorifying sadistic, child killing sociopaths, or you have to accept that it is an unfortunate part of ideology and group dynamics that when people are fighting for the group tends to hallow them and elevate them, even though when you look into the details, a lot of the time the violence is horrible.
yeah. I think it's undeniable that any group will revere members of their group that are most willing to engage in violence. I think that's very well illustrated by the three prime ministers that we talked about:
Right,
Begin, Shamir, and Sharon. All of them engaged in horrific violence and were valorized by their society.
right.
I don't think
So
that's
did Rabin, by the
uncontroversial.
way. Rabin
Hmm.
was directly responsible for the ethnic cleansing of Lydian Ramal. He drove out 70,000 people. He was later in charge of the Israeli police, where he was famous for telling them to break the bones of unarmed Palestinian protesters during the First Intifada. So,
Right.
although he
So
made some gestures towards peace at the end of his life, he was another example of this phenomenon.
yeah, none of this surprises me. None of it I have some criticism. I have criticism about some aspects of it, but it's not surprising. I think it is indeed a universal character trait or cultural trait. The issue that I take with Palestinian militantism, is always couched or supported, buttress, whatever you want to say, by how I find their cause unjustified. I find it illegitimate and out of proportion. So it's not just the fact that they celebrate violence. I'm not. I've laid it out. Like, I'm not a pacifist. I think violence does have a place. It just needs to be properly deployed.
Boy, I'm really glad we're having this conversation because I feel like you have a lot of views of a lot of Zionists, but you have a lot more clarity and an ability to follow your own ideas logically to the conclusion. I think that you're right that when people condemn Palestinian militantism or praise of martyrs, what they are really condemning is behavior that they would not find condemnable or indeed praiseworthy in an army or a cause that they support. That they're really saying, I don't believe that people should be fighting and dying and killing for this cause. I don't believe that they should be raising their kids to look up to people who have fought and died and killed for this cause. I
Yes.
don't want this cause to be a thing fundamentally.
Right.
Um,
And just to make sure, just to clarify, it's not just the cause that I have a problem with. It's also the tactics used to further this cause. I think the cause is reprehensible, but also the tactics are bad too. So if those two aspects were not present, valorizing military heroes or whatever you want to call
mhm.
them, that's not on its own bad.
Okay. So do you feel like the tactics that Israel is using are better?
Yes.
Okay. Um, so when you're talking about premature babies in incubators being left to
Yeah, so
die
I,
and
I'm
rot,
not. I'm not gonna. That's
that's
not
better.
how you phrase it. No, that's not what I said. And I use
No, I'm just
precise
giving a
language.
specific example. I'm not trying to
I
put words
use
in
I
your
use
mouth.
precise. I aim to use. I aim to be precise in my vocabulary. You asked me if the tactics that
Right.
Israeli Defense Force uses is better. I'm
Right.
taking the whole universe of Israeli tactics. I'm not just talking. I'm not just
Right.
looking at one specific aspect. I have no problem condemning tactics or strategies used by the IDF that are atrocities or war crimes. I think it's bad to kill babies. I think it's bad to target civilians. I think there's a whole like
Mhm.
rubric to my approach to violence. So when you ask me how I feel about IDF tactics in general, I gave you an answer. That's not the same answer as specific instances that I would
I'm not saying
condemn.
you're justifying this specific instance. I'm using that as an example of the IDF tactics, which, as a broad group, you feel are superior to those of the Palestinian militant groups.
Yes, as a broad group, superior. Yes.
Okay. How do you make that determination?
It's a fuzzy assessment. You consider the universe of military action. You consider alternatives that could be engaged in, and then you just kind of like make a fuzzy assessment. There's no precision to this exercise. And maybe it'll be helpful to outline. You wanted to talk about orthogonal violence, or at least my approach to violence. That would be the rubric that I would be using to assess how good a military is overall.
Okay. I think we should come back to how good a military is overall, but let's talk about orthogonal violence. What is orthogonal violence?
So this is really just a rephrasing of the just war doctrine. It's something I thought about and came up with on my own, just like thinking about violence
Mhm.
and how to use it. The refresh it. Yeah, what I wrote was any application of violence should be oriented towards a specific goal, proportional to the objective, and carried out with humility. So those are like the three factors that I use to consider whether or not use of violence is justified. So I always consider what goal does it specifically further, how narrowly tailored is it to furthering that specific goal, and how much humility the violence giver is willing to entertain. All of these are relative metrics; they're not absolutes. So when we look at if we want to apply it to Palestinian causes, I don't even know what killing a bunch of people at a music festival, what goal that establishes. So I can't even begin to judge whether it's good or bad. So that also I can't answer the second question. I don't know if it's proportional to the goal because I don't even know what the goal is. And then the third one, how much humility they have. Hamas doesn't have any humility about criticism regarding its tactics. So by those three factors that I outlined, the music festival massacres fails. We can go through any operation or tactic
Okay.
that you want to go that you want to assess, but those were the factors that I
Okay.
used to
Let's
outline.
talk about the Holocaust.
Okay, so the
Orthogonal or
Holocaust.
not?
How?
Was the Holocaust orthogonal violence?
Yes.
How
Uh,
so? I
well, I
mean, they
would
had a
when
specific goal. They wanted to exterminate these undesirable groups. They
right.
pursued that goal by first encouraging them to immigrate and then forcibly deporting them. And then, when they no longer really had a place to deport them to, physically destroying them.
Right.
So the
So
humility criteria, I think, is a difficult one. But just for the moment, taking the first two criteria, they had a specific goal and were pursuing it by the means at their disposal to accomplish it. And we're actually very successful with it.
right, the implicit goal. I guess I should also spell this out, but the implicit aspect of the first factor is that whether or not that goal is justified. If you just
Oh,
want to kill a bunch of people, then if that's your goal, that then anything can be justified. And if you only consider a very narrow interpretation of the factors that I outlined, but implicit of it and part of it is whether or not the goal is justified on its own.
right. So we come back to the fact that you do not feel that the goal of Palestinian freedom is a justified goal that people should be killing over.
Generally, yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'm
I
trying to
think
think of which
that's
aspects I would support. There might be some. I don't know. They just don't come to mind at the moment.
okay. Would the war in Gaza be an example of orthogonal violence?
No, because the Israeli goal is to destroy the capacity of. Well, actually, some aspects of it would be. The goal would be to destroy the capabilities of Hamas. Whether or not it's proportional, that's hard for me to assess because I'm not a military expert. I tried to find sources of how, assuming the goal is valid, how should Israel carry out its operations in Gaza? And it's hard to find alternative suggestions. Usually, people just have a problem with the goal itself, and they don't offer alternative suggestions.
Well, I
And
don't have a
humility,
problem
that's
with that goal. I don't think that's actually descriptive of what they're trying to accomplish in Gaza. But taking that for a moment and accepting that assumption, I don't have a problem with that goal. And I think it's I don't know how we're approaching this differently because I find it incredibly easy to articulate how Israel could be going about this differently. And
okay.
I found lots of
Like what?
articles online about it.
Like what?
So there is a strategy in counterinsurgency called clear, hold, build, was something that the US did in Afghanistan. And the idea is you go into a given area, you clear out the militants, and then you impose your own civil order so that people have services, people can get medicine, people can have food, and then you build up the society there without the militants until it can theoretically stand on its own 2 feet. Now, obviously, that didn't work great in Afghanistan, but it's still considered a central tenet of counterinsurgency theory.
I thought that theory was like comprehensively rejected over time because it didn't work in Afghanistan. What it did is it created new targets. for insurgents to attack.
I would be interested in any sources that you have that say it has been comprehensively rejected.
I
I
don't. Yeah,
still
I'll have to
understand
look
that to
through
be
it. But that
the
was my general
core theory
understanding.
underlying it. What Israel has done is they will go into an area, they will fight the militants, and then they will leave it and kill anybody who tries to restore order there. And then in the chaos and the vacuum, Hamas will then come back in, and then they will send Israeli troops in again. And they did this sometimes 3 and 4 times in separate areas, at not only a cost in Palestinian lives, but in a cost in Israeli soldiers' lives. I think
Uh,
that regardless of what you think of the clear hold build strategy, virtually universal in people who practice counterinsurgency is you have to have some vision for the power that you want to replace the militants in these areas.
mhm.
You got to have some concept of you can't just destroy it and say, okay, now we have anarchy. That's great. And Israel never articulated and still has not articulated a plan for Gaza. They said, we are going to destroy Hamas down to the last person. Now, sometimes they said they were going to destroy all of Gaza down to the last person, but we can talk about the genocidal aspects of the conflict later. In terms of military goals, they described their goals as killing every single Hamas member and destroying Hamas as an organization.
Mhm.
Now, obviously, they failed at that. They're not particularly good at war. It wasn't a particularly realistic goal to begin with. Well,
Yeah,
they're not. I
I
mean,
mean,
they're
that's like
cowards.
a
They bomb children. They murder people. They cut off
what? How do
food.
you
They
assess
leave
whether someone
babies
is
to
good at
rot.
war? How do you assess whether someone is good at war? Because I'd love to hear the argument that Israel is not good at war.
Well, somebody who is good at war, I think, is able to target militants or enemy armed forces and use the means to defeat them without making them stronger in the process, without slaughtering civilians. I mean, what we've seen for the last
So,
year in
who do you
Gaza
think
is
is
just
better at war? Which military do you look up to as better at war than Israel?
I would say the UK is better.
And like in what arena, what battlefield?
Well, like the Falklands War, for example. They had a fight over that territory. They fought there for about 6 months. They stated that as soon as the people here don't want to be under the British crown, the majority of them will let them go. If they want to merge with Hartina, that's fine. But for right now, this is UK territory.
Okay, I'd have to look
And
up
they managed
read
to
more
do
about
that
the
without
Falklands.
any death camps and without anally raping a prisoner until his intestines ruptured. They
So
were really
I'd
good
have
about that.
to. I haven't read up on the Falklands War much, but those aren't. Do you have a I guess like a more comparable scenario, one where when you're dealing with urban landscape and insurgency, whatever you want to call it, that doesn't use uniforms and also hides in tunnels?
Well, I mean, the hides and tunnels part should make everything much, much easier if they were good at war, right? Because they know exactly where the Palestinian militants are and they could just go in there and kill them.
The
There
whole
aren't
point
any
of tunnels
civilians
is you
in the
don't know where
tunnels.
they are.
No, they know where the tunnels are. They can find the entry to these tunnels. They've repeatedly found the entries to these tunnels.
You have to have boots on the ground to find entries to the tunnels, and you also have
Right,
to
and that's
navigate
what they
booby
can't do
traps.
because they're not good at war. They're cowards.
I mean,
They don't want to have boots on the
I'm
ground. If there are boots on the ground, they might get hurt.
right, and because there's booby traps on the tunnel entrances. So, which
Oh my
army
god,
do you
booby
think?
traps. That's horrible.
Yes. So, which
You
army do you think has navigated a similar battlefield better than Israel?
well, I mean, all of them pretty much.
Which
But
one?
even like the US and Afghanistan, how many civilians were killed by the United States in Afghanistan?
I mean, Afghanistan is not a comparable battle theater.
What would you say would be a comparable theater?
That's what I'm trying to think. that's what I'm actively been searching for. If Israel is doing this badly, who is doing better? So it's easy to say Israel shouldn't do this. Okay, but what should they do
Right.
instead?
Well, what they should do is not attack the civilian population
Okay,
and
how do you
not cut
avoid
off access
attacking the
to
civilian
food and
population?
what's that?
How do you avoid attacking? Well, first, how do you distinguish the civilian population, and then how do you avoid attacking the civilian population in an urban landscape?
Well, the first thing that you do is that when you capture an area, you make sure that food, medical supplies, and other critical civil services are still provided there. That
Uh,
that is very
sure,
important.
provided it doesn't get captured by the militant insurgency, right?
Well, that shouldn't happen if you've captured the area.
Well, I
I
mean, you
mean,
can't
unless you're bad at
when you
war
like
and you
walk
can't
in.
occupy it because that would require boots on the ground, and that would require your soldiers, who physically speaking are cowards, to carry out an occupation.
So, which military do you think you cited the UK, but can you think of
Mhm.
any other similar battlefield, urban insurgency, that has been navigated better by another military?
Well, I mean, I think you would have to give me an example of something similar because every conflict is unique.
Sure, every conflict is unique, but we can draw like parallels because this is the issue that I keep encountering. There's a lot of criticism for how Israel is conducting its war, but then
Right.
I ask, okay, what should it do different? Can you point
But I'm
to?
giving you very specific examples of what they should do differently. They
But
have
if
starved the population. They have starved the population. They have they have bombed water treatment plants. They have forced people out of their homes into what they called safe zones and then bombed the safe zones. They've forced people, they have had rotating safe zones where it's safe this week, but next week you got to go 20 miles in this direction. You
so
know,
you can you think if you're assessing military tactics, ideally you have a template in your head that
yeah,
tells you here's how it was done differently.
yeah, that would
So
be the clear hold build model.
yeah, but that model, my understanding is that it was explicitly rejected by the IDF because it was such a failure in Afghanistan. It just created
No, no, it
more
was
and more
rejected by the
targets.
IDF because they wanted to punish the Palestinian population and kill and drive out Palestinians.
Okay,
Like the prime minister of Israel said that the Palestinians in Gaza are like Amalek. Do you know the story of Amalek?
I think it's a biblical reference. I don't know if they're referring
You
to the
think
Palestinian
it's a biblical
population
reference.
or
Okay. Okay.
like
Well, the
I'm
story of
trying to figure
Amalek,
out like what has anyone actually implemented these tactics that you're describing.
these
You're not a
tactics of
military.
allowing food in,
Yes, within the a battlefield theater similar to Gaza, because you're not a
you just
military.
allow the food in, man. You don't bomb the world's central kitchen truck. Like, this is not complicated.
It is complicated. You're talking about a battlefield. You're talking about war operations in a live battlefield. That is that's like the essence of
Right, but the
complicated.
laws of war say you don't cut off food and other essential services to civilians because it's a theater of war.
How do you
This is
distinguish
why we have
civilians?
the Geneva
How do
Convention.
you distinguish civilians against an enemy that doesn't use uniforms?
Why is that important when you're talking about food?
Because you said you shouldn't deny civilians food and water. The first part
Well,
of that is how do you distinguish civilians from militants?
but is that an important distinction?
Yes, it is because you
I
can't
don't
deny
think it's an
food.
important distinction.
You
We
can't
know that
deny
Hamas has stores of
you
food in the
can
tunnels.
you can
You're not
deny food.
starving Hamas, you're starving the civilian population. So the worst
So
case scenario here is that Hamas gets a bag of rice.
yeah,
Which you
that's bad
why?
because you give them you're supplying your enemy. That's bad. That's like that's one of the first this is the major objective in war is cut off supply from your enemy. You don't
No,
want them
no, no.
to
Starving the other side is not considered to be a valid objective in war under the laws of war. Like,
starving
no.
ki- which I'm
Are you
how do
familiar with the Geneva Conventions?
which Geneva Convention says that you're not allowed to cut off your enemy's supply?
No, it's not your enemy's supply. War materials you can cut off, not food, not
That's
medicine.
rations.
It's the Fourth Geneva Convention specifically. I would look at it because it's really important if you're talking about the laws of war. But
And
regardless, I
so,
am giving
hold
you
on.
a
I want to
very
understand.
specific account of
I
how
know,
Israel could do it differently.
but you're eliding the vocabulary.
I don't think I
And
am.
okay,
You
I'll
are
explain.
you are
I'll explain
justifying
why.
starving a civilian population
I didn't say civilian.
because you say that part of war is cutting off supplies.
I didn't say. I don't think it's okay to starve civilians. The problem is you can't distinguish civilians in this theater.
That's not a
That's
problem.
yes, it is a problem.
Yeah, no,
Every
you don't have to
major.
starve anyone. Not that they could they could not, practically speaking, starve Hamas, because Hamas is prepared for this day for 10, 15 years. They have stores. They are feeding their own people with those stores.
I'm trying to understand the model that you're operating in. So let's consider, a battlefield that has no civilians. We have enemy combatants. Let's say it's trench warfare. Let's just pick like Russia and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
If Russian soldiers were starving and they're holding out a position, will you argue that Ukraine has an obligation to airdrop rations to them?
No, but they also would not be justified in surrounding Russia and not allowing any supplies in. That would be a violation of the laws of war.
I, that's wild to me. They would be.
Right.
There's no.
I mean,
I've
I
never heard of
understand that
any
it's
rule that
wild
says
to
you
you, but
can't
that's
surround
the
your
Geneva
enemies.
Conventions.
I'm sorry.
I understand that that's wild to you, but that doesn't change what the law is.
I've never heard of a Geneva Convention that says you're not allowed to cut off supply to your enemy.
But you haven't read the Geneva Conventions and you don't know what they say.
Yeah, that's true. I concede that. I've never heard of any rule, any law, any policy, any norm, anything that says you're not allowed to surround an enemy that's actively fighting you. This is the basis of all like military maneuvers. You cut off supply, you create pockets, you surround your enemy so that they surrender. That's the essence of military maneuvers.
Right, but not by starving a civilian population.
I
And the fact
remember the
that a
example that I
teacher
gave
can
you.
be
Hold
a
on, hold on, hold on,
militant.
hold on. No. I'm not doing this. The example I gave you is no civilians on the theater.
Right, but that's
Only
not
enemy
the
combatants.
reality. That's not
Well, right.
the
It's called a hypothetical. So I'm trying to understand the principles that you're operating at. So if we have two enemy forces fighting each other, there's no civilians around whatsoever. You're claiming that it's illegal. It's a war crime to cut off supply to the enemy.
food to cut off
How does
food.
that work? Like you can surround them, but then you have to let trucks in with rations.
Right, but that's not the situation.
It's called a hypothetical because I want to understand the
Right,
principles that you're
right,
operating
right.
on.
So by your logic, like not all Israeli soldiers are in uniform all the time, right?
I don't know.
They're
I think
not.
some special forces use. Okay,
They're not always in uniform.
are you
So why
trying
are you
to
objecting to suicide bombs?
are you trying to
I mean,
change the
there are
subject
Israeli
away?
soldiers on that bus, right?
You're trying to change the subject. I'm
No,
happy to
I'm
talk
trying
about
to
that
explore
later.
the consequences of your analogy where if there are any fighters in a population, anything that you do to that population is morally justifiable if it would be justifiable to do it to a population entirely of those fighters.
Potentially, but the complication here is that you can't distinguish militants from civilians. That's the first problem. But I'm
Not
not
a
gonna. I'm
problem.
not moving on from the point. Are you actually going to argue that it's not allowed to surrender enemy? You're not allowed to surround enemy forces.
No, I wouldn't say you're not allowed to surround
Okay,
enemy
well,
forces.
you are allowed to surround enemy forces. Are you
Mhm.
allowed to cut off munitions to your enemy?
Yes.
Are you allowed to cut off rations to your enemy?
No.
How would that work in your mind?
Read that. It's not my mind. It's international law. You
Okay,
just need
point
to
me.
read the Geneva
Let's
Convention.
go through this. Let's do this. Let's do a live exercise. Let's find
Okay.
out where in the Geneva Convention it says that you enemy forces military forces have an obligation to feed active enemy
No, it's not
combatants.
feed, it's allowing food in.
Okay,
Israel does not let
all right,
anyone
sure,
else
sure,
supply Gaza with food. They
fine.
control the supply of Gaza so that they have the power to starve the people there when they want to.
So I want to know where in the Geneva Convention it says that an enemy force is not allowed to cut off food supply, to an active confrontational force.
You want to
Like,
know where it says they can't cut off food supplies to civilians?
no, I didn't say civilians.
No, you
I'm
didn't,
talking
but
about.
that's the situation. You want to talk about a different situation. Can you
No,
show
I'm
me
dealing.
can you show
Here's
me
what I'm
where it
doing.
says in the Geneva Conventions that you can't blow up your enemy?
That you can't blow up.
Yeah, that you can't blow yourself up in a crowd of your enemy.
I don't think that's in the Geneva Convention.
It's not. So therefore, there's no reason to be hostile to suicide bombers, right? Because if they blow
We've
themselves
already
up in a
established
crowd of
this.
their enemies,
I didn't say that suicide attacks are necessarily bad. I've already outlined my factors. So
right?
again, I'm being precise with my vocabulary. You don't need to rephrase it in a inaccurate way.
I don't think I am rephrasing it in an inaccurate way. So, Fourth
Let me
Geneva
explain what I'm
Convention,
doing.
Chapter 3, Food and Clothing. So this is about
Which
interning.
Geneva Convention is this?
This is the Fourth Geneva Convention.
Chapter 3?
Yeah, this is about internment, though.
Right. That's when you capture, when you have POWs. There's a
Right.
different rules that apply to that. So we're talking about active conflict.
This is AI, so take it with a grain of salt. We'll find the specific part. The Geneva Conventions prohibit the use of starvation as a weapon of war against civilians. The
Yep.
convention also requires that civilians have access to food and that
Hmm.
children, pregnant people, and nursing mothers receive additional food.
Okay. Yeah. That's about civilian population.
Right.
Does it obligate military forces to allow resupply to active enemy combatants?
What you're saying is that you can starve a civilian population if you think there's a militant in there somewhere.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm trying
If
to.
there's one militant in a population of 1,000,000 people, you can starve that population because otherwise that militant might get food.
No, at that point, every action is evaluated under the law of proportionality. How proportional the damage you're causing to civilians is to your military objective. It's kind of a fake standard because it's really easy to justify almost any military action as proportional to the cause you're furthering, especially within the chaos of a battlefield. But that's how that situation would be evaluated.
I'm really struggling to wrap my mind about how you have these strong opinions on just war and international law, but you haven't read the Geneva Conventions.
I
Like,
don't
this
have a
is
strong
not like a
opinion on
1,000-page document. This is like 20 pages.
I don't have a strong opinion on the Geneva Convention. I think the rules of war are, I don't know how to say this. This is a whole other topic. I think they have a noble purpose, but they're fake. It's kind of just like a fake law. It's still very bizarre to me to create rules within a battlefield where there's a regimented structure of thousands of men, all with the purpose of killing the other side. It's weird to talk about how to do that properly. I understand the purpose, the point. It just the application of it just turns very messy. So my opinion is not predicated on whether or not the Geneva Convention allows something or prohibits something. I use a different rubric for that. It's just basically I just argue based on morality rather than citing specific Geneva Convention.
Okay, so we're not
Causes.
talking about international law. We're talking about morality. Is it moral to starve a civilian population?
Starve how? Intentionally?
Yeah.
No, it's not moral.
Okay. So do you think Israel is starving Gaza unintentionally?
I think you could argue that at least some facets of the IDF, I don't know the relative proportions, but there will be some facets that want Palestinians to starve to death, some facets that don't care if Palestinian civilians starve to death, and some that aren't. That's not part of their motivation. I don't know what the relative proportion is.
But what's the government's policy?
I don't know.
Are they allowing in? Have they been? So we have a ceasefire. So it's difficult to talk about what's going to happen in the future because this has only been in existence for 4 days. But up to now, over the last 14 months of war, have they allowed supplies into Gaza sufficient to sustain the population there?
Yeah, close to sufficient.
Close to sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't think that people are starving there?
What's your definition of starving?
I would say a famine. In a famine, people starve.
What's your definition of a famine?
It's not my definition. The UN has a definition.
What's their definition of a famine?
Well, let's look it up. Why is that humorous?
Because I've gone down this route before. I tried to find out what the definition was because there have been endless warnings about how Gaza is on the verge of famine, imminent
Right.
hunger.
Right.
The claim kept repeating over and over again.
Because it was happening.
Depends how you. I tried to find the definition and I couldn't. It was.
So it took me about 10 seconds. So on UN.org, it says, what is the threshold for famine? Famine is essentially a technical term referring to a population that faces widespread malnutrition and hunger-related deaths due to a lack of food.
Right.
We say there is a famine when 3 conditions come together in a specific geographic area, whether a town, a village, a city, or even a country, Mr. Hussein explained. And the 3 points are at least 20% of that population are facing extreme levels of hunger, 30% of the children in the place are wasted or too thin for their height, and the death or mortality rate has doubled from the average, surpassing 2 deaths per 10,000 daily for adults and 4 deaths per 10,000 daily for children. That is the definition of a famine.
Yeah, I tried to find the specific definitions of what exactly counts as extreme hunger, what exactly counts as too thin for their age, and how do you attribute deaths from malnutrition and hunger specifically rather than just deaths from other causes. And I couldn't find it. This is orthogonal to the overall topic.
So
we can I'd be glad to have this do this again if you want to talk specifically about the conditions in Gaza and whether or not they amounted to a famine. I tried to look at more information in that a while ago and found the sources wanting.
But I mean, you're talking about suicide bombings.
Yep.
Which were a thing 20 years ago. Primarily I would say about 90% of all suicide bombings carried out by the Palestinian factions occurred before 2005. Following that, prior to the invasion of Gaza, all of the militant factions had pretty much abandoned the tactic and regarded it as unproductive and damaging to the Palestinian cause in the long run. But these things 20 years ago, including non-existent 14-year-old suicide bombers, you think that these immoral criminal actions against a civilian population are important enough that they are the Rosetta Stone for Palestinian culture. But here we're talking about atrocities that are unfolding today at the bidding of the Israeli government, where people are being starved, where people are being killed, where a civilian population is being systematically harmed. How is that not the point? I mean, you seem to have one narrow fixation on a tiny part of the violence here that just happens to be the violence by the people that you don't like against the people that you do like. But there's this
So
whole other world of violence.
So I focus on the tactics that Palestinian militant groups have engaged in because I find that to be the most distinguishing aspect of Palestinian culture. If you want to point me
Based
to, let
on
me
not
finish,
reading
please.
anything by Palestinians,
Let me
not being
finish,
familiar
please.
with any
If
Palestinian entertainers or musicians or artists,
I
not
just
knowing
don't
the names
care. I
of any
don't give a
Palestinian
shit.
politicians.
If like a Palestinian author created a cool novel and a cool play and wrote some beautiful poetry, good on them. That's
Yeah.
commendable. It's not going to erase or counter the insane militancy on the other on the con side. So it just doesn't matter. It's not going to wash away those sins. So that's
What
what I
sins?
find
I mean, we talked about how
the
praising
militancy.
militants, praising
Yep.
people who fought and died is
Hmm.
more or less a universal human characteristic.
Right. And I
What
gave you
do you
the
think the
factors.
Palestinians have done that other
I
people
gave
under
you the
occupation in other parts of the world, like the Algerians, the
Robert,
Vietnamese, the
this is
Malay,
Robert.
Filipinos, have
We've
not
already gone
done?
through this. I've already conceded that there's nothing wrong with praising martial ability. There's nothing wrong with praising what you consider to be the warriors in your society. That on its own is not the problem. The problem is the objectives they have suck. The tactics they
What are
use
the
suck.
objectives that they have that suck?
Hamas wants to kill all the Jews, and Israel wants to hates having Jews having their own
By
country
by what? Why do you think they want to kill all the Jews in Israel?
because they keep saying it.
Where? Show me where they say that.
I don't. I can give you like a shit ton of quotes and
Give me just
videos and
one.
spokesperson.
I would settle for just one right now.
I'd have to find it.
اخواننا زي ما تقول لسه بيستعدوا برا بيحاولوا يستعدوا بيسخنوا صار لهم سنه ونص بيسخنوا خلص يا 7 مليون فلسطيني برا بكفيكوا تسخين في عندكم يهود في كل مكان يجب ان نهجم على كل يهودي متواجد في الكره الارضيه ذبحا وقتلا باذن الله سبحانه وتعالى بكفي تسخين خلاص وبدنا اياكم يا اهل القدس بالسكاكين امعطوا رقاب اليهود كلها هي تقف على العرق من هان 5 شيكل تشتري لك سكينه واضيه مضيها وهنا على طول حزه 5 شيكل 5 شيكل انك تذل دوله الكافر.
I just don't.
I mean,
I didn't know like what level of preparation to have. Like, do I need to prove basic tenets about Hamas's
yes,
homicidal
absolutely you
urges?
do, because as we've already established, some of the basic tenets that you believe, like the beheaded babies, are just completely wrong.
No,
So, I
because
mean,
that
if you
wasn't
had
one
your
of the
facts
tenets I
wrong,
believe.
if you
That
weren't
wasn't one of
talking
the
about a
tenets I believe.
14-year-old suicide bomber that doesn't exist,
It does exist. There was an
it
attempted
doesn't.
suicide bomber. You
It
just don't
doesn't. You
think.
haven't found a 14-year-old suicide bomber.
You don't
You
believe that the
haven't
evidence
found
I
one.
presented was sufficient.
It
You have a
wasn't.
very narrow definition of it.
It wasn't. You
Okay.
presented evidence of
Mhm.
one case of a 12-year-old who was carrying a bomb in a satchel.
Yeah, I think that's enough to establish that Palestinian groups have used children or tried
Right.
to use children
In the way that a
as
12-year-old
suicide bombs.
serving in the U.S. Navy in World War II proves that the United States Navy used child soldiers.
Yes, if the United States was actively recruiting or praising teenagers that joined the military instead of having an
You know how
age.
I know about this 12-year-old? Because
Robert,
there are posters
you're
about him in the
asking
VA.
me you're asking me questions, but then cutting me off. If the United States was actively recruiting, or either the apparatus, the military, or society was actively recruiting teenagers to go into the military, that would be bad. That would be an example of the aspect that I'm identifying within Palestinian culture.
But we read the Wikipedia
Indoctrination.
page where there's no evidence that the Palestinian societies are doing this. They say they're not doing it. No one has found evidence that they're systematically recruiting children.
Okay, you're again putting up like a straw man of my claim.
No, you're claiming that they are systematically recruiting children, and the source that you offered says that there's no evidence that that's the case. So
Which
why
source
do you
was that?
believe that?
I gave you the 4 factors. I gave you the valorization of suicide bombing in general, the indoctrination that specifically targets children, the endless songs about how much we have to kill the Jews to get Al-Quds back. I gave you multiple aspects that point to this phenomenon. And you're just saying there's no evidence of that. That's maybe they were just carrying explosives to something. I don't even know what the argument is.
The
I
argument
think it's
would be
sufficient evidence. I can't convince you otherwise, obviously, but I'm presenting why I believe that.
okay. But I mean, this is the thing: is that you haven't found a 14-year-old suicide bomber. You haven't
Yeah,
found
not
evidence
one
of a
that was
14-year-old
competent enough to
suicide
carry
bomber,
out their mission. That's
direct or
true.
indirect. So my point stands that you are going to be asked to show your sources for some of these simple things, because some of them you
Mhm.
just have wrong. So
I didn't say okay. Yeah, you got me. There was no successful suicide bomber. There was no successful suicide bomb enacted by a teenager. You got me.
there wasn't an attempt either. As
I
far
mean,
as,
you don't believe it's an attempt, but
I mean,
that's your prerogative.
well, you think that a 12-year-old carrying a bomb in a satchel, even though you don't know if they had a detonator, you don't know if they planned to use it, you don't know if, oh, okay.
I think that's good enough evidence. Yeah.
Let's talk about another important example. So in one of your pieces, you're talking about the Yom Kippur War.
Okay.
And you say that in the Yom Kippur War, the Arab countries, which confusingly you seem to think means the same thing as the Palestinians, the Arab countries invaded Israel for the second time in 6 years, again, launching a surprise attack.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
I
So
think
my question is, walk me through the Arab states' invasion of Israel in 1967. How did that surprise attack unfold?
there was military buildup at the border between Egypt and Israel. Israel saw that as a preparation for an invasion, and they preemptively attacked Egypt, wiped out their air force within a couple days.
Okay. So in the 1967 war, the way that the Arab states invaded Israel in a surprise attack was that Israel invaded the Arab states in a surprise attack.
Yeah, the attempted invasion failed.
What
Correct.
attempted invasion? I mean, did a
Egypt, Jordan,
single
and Syria
soldier,
were planning a surprise invasion. That's what I wrote.
based
They
on
were
what?
planning.
Based on what? Like,
Uh,
planning it isn't doing it, right? You can't say it was a surprise attack if
I'm
it was in the
familiar. I'm
planning.
familiar with this line of argumentation. I know there's going to be some quotes from like U.S. State Department diplomat at the time, and then some general in Egypt that said that they weren't planning an invasion. That actually Israel was the aggressor on all this. They're the ones that instigated this. They use a pretext. I'm familiar
I
broadly
mean,
with all of
we
this.
don't have to go into that. Did the Arab states invade Israel in a surprise attack?
No, their planned invasion failed.
Is that
It
not
got
the
foiled.
exact opposite of what happened, where Israel invaded the Arab states in a surprise attack?
What I wrote was, let's see, 1967, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria planned a surprise invasion against Israel, but instead got absolutely trounced. So,
That's a different place. And let me find the passage that I'm talking about, where you say that in 1973 they invaded for the second time.
I mean,
But I mean, this is what I mean. These are basic historical facts that I think are very important to the credibility of any argument that you might want to make.
no,
If you're
I
talking
mean,
about
look,
the moral
this
responsibility of
is
Germany for World War II,
no, but this
here
is
we are. Let me read it. Not content with their first military invasion, they
mhm.
tried another surprise attack 6 years later in 1973.
Yep.
Yeah. So if somebody wants to talk about relative moral responsibility for World War II, and they start out by saying, when Poland invaded Germany in 1939, I think you're probably going to have some questions.
Sure.
Not just how reliable
And
this person's information is, but where
sure,
did
yeah,
they
yeah, yeah.
get this information? What are their
Not,
sources?
yeah. Okay,
this
maybe I
is
should.
what they believe.
You got me. I should have said not content with their first planned invasion, they tried another invasion in 1973. So that was a mistake on my part.
Well, I mean, I don't think it was something that is entirely on you, because Israel has tried assiduously in the last 50 plus years
No, no,
to
no.
present their surprise attack on the Arab states as an attack on them. It's not
Sure.
it's not
This
a myth or
when
something
I
that you
wrote
pulled
this,
out of thin air.
this was one paragraph. I didn't go into a ton of detail. So the implication when I said not content with their first invasion is I was referencing the earlier sentence that clarified they were planning a surprise invasion. So that
Well,
I
they
should have
weren't,
said,
but
sure, whatever. I should have said not content with their first planned attempted invasion, but in the interest of brevity, I dropped the planned and assumed that people would understand the context I was talking about. So you got me on that mistake.
okay. But I mean, my
I
objective
didn't
is not
want.
to get you, but it's to illustrate how some of the propaganda that you've taken in about this conflict involves very basic factual questions. And that is why I'm questioning them. It's
Yeah,
not
it
that I'm
would.
trying
I
to be
mean,
contrarian.
there's. I like factual accuracy, but it would be more interesting if you actually attacked something that was load bearing. Because if you get me to admit error or concede that the Yom Kippur War wasn't actually an invasion or whatever you want to say, it's not going to change the overall argument that I make. And that's I didn't want to just like highlight, oh, in this particular paragraph you omitted the word attempted invasion, which implies that actually like that's just uninteresting. I'm not saying it's always like you shouldn't point out factual accuracies, but this is not load bearing. It's not, my belief system is not predicated on these tiny factual disputes.
I mean, I think that I hear what you're saying, and I think that there is a charitable version of that which says, like, don't nitpick, really look at the very fundamentals of the argument. And I definitely want to do that. But I think that we have to be, sorry, I have a
Yeah,
very emotionally needy cat here. I
I
think that
know. I know the feeling. Don't worry.
we have to be careful, because when you are invested in a belief, whatever it is, and I include myself in this, I include everyone in this, you build it up over a period of time. So there are a lot of different supports for them, and some of them are factual, some of them emotional, some of them are grounded in history, things you've read, things that you've had impressions of. And it is too easy to confirm the things we think when one strand of this gets under strain by referring to all of the other strands. This is
I
something you will frequently see from climate deniers. If you really pin them down on one of their unfortunately copious errors of fact and judgment and mathematics, you'll be like, no, you did the math wrong here. And see, if you do the math right, it shows the exact opposite of what you're saying it shows. And,
I know exactly what you're describing. That's why
95 internet comments later, they will say, well, of course, this equation is wrong, but my beliefs are still correct because of all of these other pieces of evidence that we haven't discussed in this conversation. That's
I
like a
understand
human
the
thing. I don't,
I understand and agree with the concern that you're illustrating, and I've encountered this multiple times. So I'm not faulting you for bringing it up, but you know, I was like transparently, I was hoping for um, a broad discussion on the fundamentals. I'm
so what,
sure I'm
okay.
sure that like I've made mistakes, but the or like small factual errors, but the problem is like that doesn't change. That wouldn't propagate to changing anything.
But
So I mean,
shouldn't
just to
that create a
compare,
some sense of doubt? I mean, I don't think
yeah,
these
of
are
course.
small things. I
I,
think you write a lot in different places about epistic humility and how hard it is and how important it is to be prepared to consider that you're wrong. And like, I have not made an exhaustive study of your work, and these are really basic things about the conflict that are wrong. Now, I don't think that that means that you're wrong about everything. I don't think that it means that you're wrong about your core arguments. But I think that if you are consistent in the things that you say you believe, things like this should give you pause and make you say, if these are things I believe about the conflict that are not factually well supported, is it possible that there are other important things that are more load bearing that are not as well grounded in the evidence as I think they are? That's
Of
all.
course.
But
That's
let's
that's
go
that's
broad. Let's
always
talk about it. What are the what are the big issues to you? What are the fundamental things?
well. What you said is I don't have. Remember how I came to this issue? I didn't know shit
Hmm.
uh, about this up until
Some would
like
say you still don't.
okay, sure, yeah. But the feedback, the things that you chose to attack were well, maybe the 12-year-old that was caught with explosives at the security checkpoint was just transporting explosives rather than trying to be a suicide bomb. I mean, that just comes across as incredible, but that's what you want to address. Like out of everything that I've written, that's what you want to address.
Well, you made these specific factual claims that are incorrect. Most of your claims, most of anybody's claims when they're doing writing like this are too impressionistic, too vague to chase down and promote and show and clearly factually refute. And you can clearly factually refute the story of a 14-year-old suicide bomber. You can even chase it back to its origins where they arrested somebody who they initially thought was 14 and turned out to be 16. And they cleared that up
So
in a
there's
day.
different ways to approach this. If I'm being too vague, you can ask me to specify. Even if I'm being vague, you can still uh, demonstrate that somehow. And I don't know if you listened to my conversation about Ray Epps from a while ago. I was talking to someone who vaguely believed that Ray Epps was an informant and that January 6th was a federal operation. Blah blah blah. And
I
I
didn't see it. I'd like to see it.
it was fun, and we spent. I at the beginning I wouldn't be have been. I still can't articulate what my interlocutor was actually trying to say because it was very vague and very evasive. But I started big picture. I said, "What's the deep state?" And that took like an hour, and it didn't go anywhere because I couldn't nail him down on any specifics. So if you think I'm being vague, that's something that you can try. You can nail me down on specifics.
Let's talk about the big picture. What do you think are the big picture questions here?
Of the conflict.
Sure.
Um, there's essentially two groups of people that have very different objectives, and some objectives are worth more than others. The way they proceed towards achieving those objectives are better than others. That would be like the very, very big picture one. Maybe this would dovetail into you wanted to talk about Israel having a right to exist. I don't know if that would be a good segue into that.
I mean, maybe. So you've said that you feel like the Palestinian cause is not it's not a good cause, it's not a justified cause. What do you understand the Palestinian cause to be?
You're gonna get some evasion from um, the proponents. The one aspect would be Arabs just don't like Jews, and they especially don't like having a relatively successful and wealthy Jewish state win in their midst. It's a humiliation from a nationalistic standpoint, especially from a religious standpoint when you consider the importance of Jerusalem. And so that's one of the prime motivators. Um,
Of
I
the
think that's
Palestinians.
the broader anti-Israel cause that includes Palestinian militancy. I'm looping in a lot of neighboring Arab countries, so that would be that motivation. I think it's fucked up. I have no reason to support or be sympathetic to.
Well,
Um,
I'm just trying to understand. Like, I understand that as potentially a motive for Egypt or Syria or Jordan, if we want to psychoanalyze that. And maybe that's an important part of the motivation. Maybe it isn't. But I don't see how you're connecting that back to the Palestinians. I
well, the
I don't
Palestinians
see
are
a Palestinian
supported.
sitting in a refugee camp in Lebanon who has lost everything that they had is thinking, boy, it's really humiliating to the Arabs that the Israelis control Jerusalem. That's
That's one part.
really
Yeah.
I
I mean
I
that's why Al Aqsa Mosque is so prominent in Hamas's imagery. Al Aqsa Flood, Al Aqsa Brigades. They always talk about the Quds and how they want to regain it. That's a
yeah,
humiliation.
but I mean the but that's not the humiliation of the Arabs. That's the humiliation of people who have lost control of their homeland.
I mean that includes the Arabs and Muslims in general. There's obviously overlap between the two. So it's a religious and nationalistic humiliation. Yes.
Mhm.
What's wrong with what I just said?
Well, I think that it's not parsimonious, because if you look at the history of people who have been occupied by outsiders, there's a lot of history of that, unfortunately.
Hmm.
And the natural history of this is that the people who have been occupied in the modern world get angry and fight back. And you can see this, for example, in Ireland. So I was looking this up. Okay. Irish uprisings. Silken Thomas Rebellion in 1534. First Desmond Rebellion, 1569 to 73. Second Desmond Rebellion, 9 Years' War. O'Doherty's Rebellion, Irish Rebellion of 1641. Irish Confederate Wars, Willamette War, Irish Rebellion of 1798. And it goes
Huh.
on. We're not even
There's
into the 19th
a
century.
lot of conflicts all over the world. Yes.
But do you think that the Irish were fighting the British out of a sense of humiliation?
One aspect, sure.
Yeah.
It's
So
I mean, do you
I would agree
deny?
with that.
Are we denying that nationalism exists?
I agree that there is an element of humiliation in an anti-colonial struggle. I agree with that, but I don't think that it is particular to this cause, and I don't think it illegitimates it in the way that you seem to be implying. Like,
What is wrong with what I just described? Is the issue is that I'm exaggerating it too much? Exaggerating that aspect too much?
well, I think first of all, your issue is that you're conflating Palestinians with other Muslims and Arabs, and you're implying that the Palestinians are upset in the same way Arabs and Muslims who are not directly affected by Israel's invasion, ethnic cleansing, and occupation of Palestine are. I don't like that.
Not
I don't
exactly the
agree with
same
that.
way. I think there's a common thread.
Yeah, and I mean that is also part of the history of rebellions, anti-colonial and otherwise, is that they attempt to engage outsiders to support them. And successful rebellions, for example, the American rebellion against the British in the War of Independence, rely heavily on the ability to enlist outsiders, in this case, France, to get support against this more powerful imperial state. So
Sure.
I do think that certainly part of the rhetoric of Palestinian militancy is going to be to tend to emphasize the Arab and Muslim identities, to try, mostly unsuccessfully, I must say, over the last 7 years, to get support from other people sharing those aspects of their identity.
Sure. So what is wrong with what I said?
I mean, I don't think it's wrong in the sense that it's refuted. I think it's a question of, I would make the emphasis a little different. I would say that the primary trauma for the Palestinians is the loss of their homeland. The primary thing that they are trying to reverse, their goal is to get their homeland back, to be able to live there in freedom
What
and safety.
what do you consider a homeland to be? Is it tied to ethnicity? Like, why can't their current location, or why can't their homeland be elsewhere? Why can't they move to neighboring countries?
Why can't the Jewish colonists move to neighboring countries?
Because
Why
they
can't
got
they go
kicked
back
out
to?
by the Arab population
But
throughout the
no,
late
they
20th
didn't.
century.
They didn't get cocked out
What
by
was
the
the
Arab
population
population.
of Jews in the Middle East and at the time of Israel's founding?
Something like 1.2 million people.
And what is it now?
It's very low because Israel recruited those people to come to Israel. Are you
Yeah.
familiar with the Million Arab Plan?
No.
This was something that Zionism came to after it realized that the destruction of European Jewry made it demographically very difficult for them, even though they had won control of the state. And they set it as their goal to bring in 1 million Arab Jews within 5 years.
How did they manage to empty out all the Jews from the Middle East? They just convinced them to come to Israel?
Well, there were a variety of ways. One part of it certainly was a spike in anti Semitism after the war and Israel's ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. That
Okay.
definitely was a factor. And an anticipated factor. If you look at the writings of Theodore Herzl, where he says
Yeah.
the anti Semites will be our greatest allies, they're going to be our greatest friends, they're going to be our strength. That is what he's talking about. Zionism was foreseen and intended to exacerbate anti Semitism, which would
It's
cause those societies be more hostile and would persuade those Jews to leave. So,
it's too bad that Arabs couldn't just not give in to that impulse, right?
well, they tried in numerous places like Egypt. Jewish immigration was actually forbidden, you know, but it is difficult to fight these
Jewish
kinds of
immigration,
immigration from Egypt,
Jews couldn't leave.
right?
Okay. I'm not sure what you, none of what you're saying, I don't, comes close to refuting my claim. The my claim is that the Arabs are don't. There's a strain within Arab ideology, Muslim ideology, that doesn't like Jews. If they're going to tolerate Jews, they have to be a contained minority. That's why we saw the levels of Jews in the Middle East go from 1.2 million, as you said, to basically zero. The highest
Well,
Jewish population
where
right
were they
now
not a
is.
minority?
I'm sorry.
I mean, you're saying that they want Jews to be minorities. Where were
To
they not a
remain
minority?
a minority. If they're going to live in Arab countries, they want to be a contained minority living within certain quarters. So the
And
highest population of Jews right now is in Morocco, where I'm from. That's
right,
2,000 Jews. That's the highest number of Jews in any Arab country anywhere.
right.
It just dropped
There were a lot more in
precipitously.
Iran, for example.
Sure, and so that is evidence of the nationalistic and religious strain against Judaism and
I
Jewish
don't
people.
I don't think that it is. Like
Okay.
there are very few Jews in Russia, because when Russia opened up in the 1990s, Israel was a vastly richer, more prosperous, more secure place. And millions of people, many of whom were not considered Jewish by the laws of Israel, but had a Jewish grandparent or were married to a
Right. That
Jewish
was
person.
that explains like the exodus in the 1990s. But
Yeah,
we're talking about the exodus from the Middle East throughout since the founding in
right.
1948.
And that is a huge subject, man. We can dig
Okay.
into it, but it's gigantic because the situation was different in each country. Some governments fed into and participated in the anti-Semitic spikes. Some of them fought it. Some of them fought it ineffectually. Some of them fought it strongly. In some cases, Israel was actively encouraging the people to come there. That campaign took different forms in different
Right.
countries.
So if I make the claim that Arabs and Muslims in general don't like having Jews living in their countries, what would you say to refute that?
I would say, show me your evidence.
The mass exodus, the litany of pogroms, the dhimmi status of Jews had within Islamic empires, the specific segregated quarters that they lived in, that would be a part of the evidence.
What pogroms?
I'd have to go through the list of all countries in the Middle East. There's tons of them. If I remember from Morocco, there was one in Fez that happened, I think, in the 1800s. I'd have to go through it. But
I mean,
I gave you multiple factors. It's not just one.
you did, but like we've got to get it down to a specific. That's something that I can investigate and look at the facts of it and
I mean,
see
you could
how I feel
I
about
don't
it.
know. If I gave you multiple factors, do you deny any of them or do you question any of them? Maybe we can start there. Which
I
ones
mean,
do
I
you
question
contest?
all of them. Like you have two major populations of Jews in, prior to the 19th century. You have the Sarafedi Jews in the Arab countries, and you have the Ashkenazi Jews in the European countries. Um, and there are populations of Jews all over the world because Judaism is a religion. It's not fundamentally an ethnicity, even though anti Semites and Zionists like to pretend that it is. There are Indian Jews and Ethiopian Jews, etc. But the two major populations are the Sepharim and the Ashkenazi. So I guess my 50,000-foot question would be, which set of societies do you think did better with tolerating the Jews over the last 1,000 years?
That's a hard question. I don't know because the options are really
I mean,
bad.
I don't think it is a hard question. Like the Holocaust didn't happen in Morocco.
Yeah,
Like the
that's true.
Crusades, well, they did happen in the Middle East, but they didn't happen at the behest of the Middle East, you know?
Let me pause. I gotta pee.
So I guess having had a moment to think about it, I don't have any objection to the concept that there was anti Semitism, both individual and systemic, in many Arab societies.
Okay,
And I think that it would be a complicated exercise to say, well, how much anti Semitism compared to anti Semitism in European societies, for example, that would be an elaborate exercise and probably not constructive or necessary.
sure.
Bigotry is bad. Bigotry
Okay,
is
so
bad.
we can agree bigotry is bad, and
Yeah.
I agree that it's a complicated exercise to tease out the exact
Yeah.
portions of it. But that's just like one aspect. This loops back, going back to the original thread that led us into this was the validity of the Palestinian cause. Part of the reason
Right.
I don't find it legitimate is because I don't know the exact percentage, but I find that too much of it is motivated by nationalistic and religious motivation that I don't give a shit about. We can argue about the relative proportions, but that's one aspect. The other aspect, I think that only really leaves the land acquisition uh, as the only other option, only other major motivator that would exist, right?
No, there
What
are
else?
many other motivators, but it
What would be the next biggest component? The land grabbing? That's
I think
whatever you want to call it.
it would be freedom and autonomy, the ability to exist in freedom and have self determination.
What is
That I
self
think is the biggest thing.
determination to you?
Self determination is the ability to be a part of this of a society and to have it be, guided by the people who are there.
So
Um,
if the Palestinians in the West Bank they all moved to Jordan and got Jordan citizenship, would they have self determination?
no, because the Jordanians have placed a governmental system that uses the monarchy and aggressive gerrymandering to ensure that the Hashemites retain all the power, even though uniquely among the native states, they have given Palestinian refugees in Jordan citizenship, in contrast to the behavior of Syria and Lebanon and Egypt and other places. Jordan has very carefully ensured that Palestinians have no political power in Jordan.
So you said the Hashemites. Is that a royal family?
That's the royal family, but they're primary support is from the Bedouin population.
So does this mean that Jordanians don't have self determination?
No, it means that Palestinian citizens in Jordan are discriminated against.
How?
I just told you.
Well, you said the structure is set up to benefit the Hashemite.
I said that the gerrymandering ensures that control over the legislative process and the monarchy ensure that the Palestinians have no ability, even though they are a majority of the population in Jordan, to control or direct the state.
Okay, so what what are they missing out on? Let's assume everything you said is true. What are they missing for the Palestinians living in Jordan? What are they missing out on that they would otherwise have if they had what you consider self determination?
I think the ability to participate as equals in the government and society would be,
Like
but again, you then
what how
the
would that translate?
Jordanians would lose that, right?
I'm sorry.
I mean, what you want to do is you want to take Jordan away from the Jordanians and give it to the Palestinians, much like Palestine was taken away from the Palestinians and given to the Zionists. I
No,
mean, then
I don't
you're gonna
care.
drive out the Jordanians into Iraq, and you're gonna start this whole saga over again. Why not
No,
just let people live like where they live and have freedom and self determination in their homeland?
the there's this is why I wrote the last essay that I wrote, "Who Controls the Dirt," because I was trying to grapple with how this topic is discussed. I'm gonna start. I'm gonna talk about Utah, and hopefully it makes sense. So you know that Utah is dominated by Mormons, right?
Sure.
And that translates into some policy changes that you don't see in areas that are not dominated by Mormons. The most obvious one is their bizarre alcohol laws. I think it's the only state in the country that has a zero point 0.05 rather than a zero point 0.08
Hmm.
BAC limit, and they put very strict limits on the alcohol content of beer.
Right.
So if I said Mormons wish to have more of a say in Utah government in order to enact policies that are more favorable to them, I can point to specific examples. Like they want to have more regulations on alcohol. That's just like one example. So when we talk about like Jordan, Palestinians living in Jordan that are gerrymandered and kept out of the legislature, what does that translate to materially?
You mean like in terms of differences in per capita income and education and the ability to participate in the professions and that sort of thing?
Yeah, whatever.
I mean, I would have to dig into that, but
Okay.
fundamentally, they're not equal in that society. And even if they were, what you would be doing is using the generosity of the Jordanians and hosting this population in order to cement ethnic cleansing.
uh, I'm not sure like where generosity comes in. If they if
Well, like
Palestinians like
Well, in
I'm-
Lebanon and in Syria and in Egypt, Palestinians aren't citizens, and in many cases, their right to work is restricted, and they're required to remain in or near their refugee camps. So Jordan
yeah, it's
very
bad. It's bad
humanely
that
allowed Palestinians to become citizens, and ever since then, there have been Zionists who want to exploit that to say that Jordan is the new Palestine.
yeah, and I don't see a problem with just making Jordan the new Palestine. I don't see the downside.
I don't see a problem with making Palestine the new Palestine.
The problem I would have is I have no reason that Palestinian culture would be a better steward of the area than the Israeli regime.
Right, based on your extensive knowledge of Palestinian culture that includes no writings, no art,
Sure.
no music,
Mhm.
nothing, except that Palestinians, like every other occupied group in the history of human civilization, have resisted their occupiers.
No, it's that they make children's television shows where they have a cartoon mouse extol the virtues of killing Jews. That would be a more central load bearing facet of my opposition to Palestinian culture.
I mean, again, I don't trust the people who are translating that.
Okay, that's not an argument. You're just saying I don't trust it.
You're not
It
making an argument
conveniently.
either. You're claiming that this television show exists. You're not showing me that it exists. You're not showing me a valid translation. You're not telling me who produced it or how popular it is. You're not showing me the totality of the programming on there. You're using an anecdote. You're arguing by an anecdote. That's what you're doing.
It is an
You are
anecdote.
indicting an
It's just an
entire
illustrative
culture
anecdote,
based on a line in a television program for children.
right? I mean, this is one of the issues. Like, there's just it's the instinct to just deny. Like, is
No,
it
I'm not
something?
denying this program may
Does
exist.
it?
I know this program
Right,
exists.
right. But
That
I'm saying it's like,
translation may be accurate, in which case you have found one unfortunate Palestinian television program. And
mhm.
you're talking about a population of 14 million people living around the world who have existed for generations, and you
Mhm.
are judging the culture based on that.
Yeah, judging culture is
That
admittedly difficult, but I want you to
oh,
notice
you
like
don't
the
seem to be
selective.
undertaking a lot of difficulty. I mean, you haven't read a book.
I want to point out the selective skepticism that's deployed when I point out that is Palestinian culture has a television show that extols the virtue of martyrdom. You're like, well, how do we know if it's properly translated? How do we know how many people saw it? That's the
Well, does it
selective
encourage
skepticism.
martyrdom or does it encourage killing Jews? Because those are two
Killing
very
Jews.
different things,
They sing songs about how we're going to kill all the Jews and get Jerusalem back.
right?
They sing songs about this one I did understand in Arabic. It was written from the standpoint of the children of Reem Riyashi, the first female suicide bomber. The children were saying, "Why are you hugging me? Oh, it's because you're carrying a bomb. I hope I can carry a bomb myself in the future." I understood that part in Arabic. That is properly translated.
بين أحضانك يا ماما مكاني لعبة ليا أو هدية جايبها لي طب ارجعي يا ماما أوام كنت شايلة ما بين ايديكي لغم مكاني دلوقتي بس عرفت ايه كان أغلى منها
Okay.
So, like the I was just pointing out the selective skepticism here. I have no reason to think that uh, like it's hard to distinguish the motivations at play here between what propels the Palestinian cause. But in my mind, too much of it is motivated by just nationalistic and religious fervor that I have no reason to endorse. And then the other aspect is land acquisition. At least the other major aspect is land acquisition that I think people should just get over because it's just not worth the bloodshed. It would be, in my mind, far better if they just moved on with their lives, maybe settle in Jordan.
Or if the Jewish people give back the land that they stole. That would be another way for people to move
Um,
on, right?
how many? Because if we consider like all the land that was ever taken throughout all of history, do you support like violent uprisings for all of them, or do you have like an additional factor?
I do have an additional factor,
What is it?
actually. I think that if a society has been founded on a theft of land and that it is not practical or realistic or moral to give all of that land back, and the Native Americans would be a good example of that.
Why?
I think the society needs to do three things. First of all, it needs to acknowledge what it did. It needs to not gaslight the people it did it to. It needs to not pretend that its creation was an immaculate conception. It needs to say, okay, we came in and we did that. We stole this land. Secondly, it needs to make recompense for that as far as is feasible. For example, with the Native Americans, we made people many, many promises of medical care, of providing social services, of providing land that the United States hasn't lived up to. Now, even if it lived up to all of those promises, it would still be a fucking shitty deal. But they should do that. And they should look at, I would support some form of reparations for that. But third, and I think this is the most important point, do you know what the Indian Citizenship Act was?
No.
The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 stated formally that all Native Americans, whether they're born on or off the reservation, are citizens of the United States as understood by the 14th Amendment and have all of the rights and responsibilities of U.S. citizenship. That to me is the key when you have a society, as unfortunately many societies are, that are built around the theft of the land from the native people, is at the end of the day, you've got to say, we created this society on the bones of your civilization, and you have the right to participate in this society. That's a thing that we did that we can't undo, but you are going to be our absolute equals in building and participating in this society going forward.
Okay. So the aspects that are missing here are acknowledgement, reparations, and citizenship. I don't know what to call it.
Yeah, I mean, I think number 3 is absolutely the most important. I think you could even just narrow down to that.
Okay. So if like Palestinians living in West Bank and Gaza were provided citizenship and equal status, would
Yes.
that end the conflict?
Yes.
Okay. Even if it like is everything else remains the same.
Well, I mean, how would everything else remain the same? You would be immediately adding to the Israeli electorate 4.5 million Palestinians. I
And then
mean,
what would change?
look at South Africa, for example.
What would change? What would change if you added 6 million or whatever, 4 million electorates, Palestinian electorates to the Israeli citizenship? What would change?
You would not see the progressive seizure of more and more land in the West Bank. You would not see the laissez-faire attitude towards the settlement movement. There would have to be some moderation of the violence inflicted on people who are now citizens and can vote. People in Gaza and the West Bank would be able to move freely throughout Israel. They would be able to work when they want. Prior in what one might call better times, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians worked in Israel, and that was critical income that they brought back to help support their families in the West Bank and Gaza. And I would hope, I think you would have to negotiate this, but I would hope to see a reform of the law of return that would include Palestinian refugees. That would say,
what is law of right of return? How would that be implemented?
do you know what the law of return is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's I think it's strategically ambiguous the way people talk about it, but I'm familiar with the basic tenets. I want to know what you mean by it.
Law of return is different from the right of return, which in turn is different from sort of the legal controlling agencies, which are different from the UN resolutions. The law of return is a law in Israel that says anybody with one Jewish grandparent or a Orthodox convert has the right to move to Israel and claim citizenship. Sometimes in a far shallower discussion than the one we're having, I would summarize Zionism as the belief that a Palestinian from East Jerusalem doesn't have a right to live there, but Ivanka Trump does. That's sort of Zionism in a nutshell in one sense.
Right. So the law of return would apply to, I guess, people that can prove Palestinian descent.
Exactly.
Okay.
Definitely.
What you're describing, I have no problem with in the ideal.
Then we have this agreement.
Well, I just find it unfortunate that Palestinians have gotten in the way of implementing that, because anytime there is any relaxation of the security barriers, it gets exploited by terrorists. Like there was even a child that had brain cancer that was transported from Gaza to Israeli hospital to receive treatment, and they were planning a suicide bomb with that. There was the reunification law. This was, I think, back in the 70s between Palestinian residents in the West Bank and Israeli Arabs in Israel proper.
Palestinian citizens of Israel is
right, whatever you want to call them. There was a reunification plan that also was canceled after people were exploiting that to sneak across the border and commit terrorist acts. I think that's a problem. That's a problem. That's a barrier to implementing a peaceful resolution. But what you
Well, yeah,
describe.
I mean, it is a barrier, and it's worse than that, because the problem that the Palestinians have is that when they are violent, Israel inflicts much greater violence on them, and the world condemns them. But when they're not violent, Israel continues to inflict violence on them, and the world ignores them. This is an issue. Do you know what the Great Return March was?
I'm familiar with all of that. People came up to the fence. They had Molotov cocktails. They had other weapons. I know it's going to be reported by Norm Filkenstein as always entirely peaceful. I've looked at the news reports. I don't have them on hand to do a detailed look into that, but I'm familiar with this talking point. That's the one that gets repeated multiple times. That was
What
the
is the
Hamas trying
talking
to show that it's peaceful.
Well, no, I don't think Hamas was trying to show that it was peaceful, but Gazans were trying nonviolent resistance. They were trying
I
to
disagree with calling it nonviolent resistance. I think some parts of it were. I think it was definitely much more nonviolent than what Palestinians are typically used
right.
to,
And
but not
so,
entirely.
how many Palestinians were killed in the course of that?
I don't remember. It's a few hundred. I don't remember
Yeah,
exactly.
several hundred people were killed, and the world ignored them. So I think when you look at
Well, I
Palestinian
mean,
violence, which
yeah,
can be counterproductive, I certainly acknowledge that. You have to look at it in the context that Palestinian nonviolent resistance has also been severely punished and is largely ignored.
yeah.
And
I don't
for
think
example,
Palestinian nonviolent. Sorry, go ahead.
when Palestinians try and function through international organizations, for example, the UN, that's described as diplomatic terrorism. When pro Palestinian organizations in the United States want to organize boycotts of Israeli entities and people who support Israeli entities, that is described as economic terrorism. There has been this, huge wave of hatred among the Zionist community for protesters on campuses, even though this is exactly nonviolent resistance. So I think that the
Uh,
idea that,
I
well,
mean,
if there were just a
calling
Palestinian
to.
Martin Luther
Well,
King,
I mean, calling it nonviolent resistance when there's people saying go back to Poland and there's no pushback from the protesters, or when they say Al Qassam's brigade next target and there's no pushback from protesters. I'm not going to agree to calling that nonviolent. They're actively calling for violence against Jews and Israelis.
are you talking about the protests on American campuses?
Yes,
You know that a lot of those protesters were actually Jewish.
I don't care. That doesn't change if that's the message that you're going with. Go back
Right.
to Poland or Al Qassam's next brigade target.
But again,
Next
you're
target.
you're choosing a set of statements, and I'm sure you can find examples of this, expressed by a tiny percentage of the people who were involved in that protest, and you are
Well,
taking those anecdotes as representative of the whole.
I acknowledge that it might be tiny portions, but the only bridge that I make into blaming the whole is the degree of pushback that the whole gives to those tiny portions.
How do you
Uh,
assess the degree of pushback?
there's no statements made by saying we condemn these actions. We
That
don't
is
see any
that
statements
is
from.
objectively false. I can send you many, many statements from pro-Palestinian groups protesting the situation in Gaza that call out individuals at the protests, whether they were part of the movement or not, for saying and doing things that the movement doesn't want to be associated with. There was a
Okay, if you send them to me, I can include them here.
I will. There was a protest about Gaza around the time of Hanukkah, and I believe there was a Palestinian militant that threw there was a protester that threw a Palestinian flag over a menorah that was in a public place on campus. And this made national news. It was on the front page of the New York Times. And if you go and watch the video, the flag is there for generously 45 seconds before the other demonstrators rip it off and chastise the person who put it there.
Okay, it's good that they have some spine. I don't see enough of it given the examples that I cited. There's too much passivity or kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, saying, yeah, we condemn this, and then turning around and saying, actually, I retract that. Like the one Columbia University student who said all Zionists should be killed, and then walking that back and then walking back the retraction.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that he walked it back, but what are you going to do? He came under a lot of pressure.
I mean, that's a problem.
I mean, you say that if someone says everyone who's Hamas should be killed, I mean, I think that is an equivalent statement to saying that Zionists should be killed. I mean, Zionists are kind of the original Hamas. These are people based on their religious identity who invaded another land and systematically expelled, ethnically cleansed the people who were there, and are now murdering literally tens of thousands of children. Like, Hamas is small beans. Hamas is like a kid with a slingshot compared to a tank. And this is something I really feel like I have difficulty with perspectives like yours, because you have this sense of horror at Palestinian violence, but it's like a painter who goes out all day painting houses, and they come home and they got a little bit of a paint on their smock. And, you might be unhappy about that. You might be like, Stan, be more careful. You might be, I just got that smock. But you wouldn't be like, oh my God, how did you possibly get this paint on you?
I mean, the distinction is that
fighting against sociopathic, child-killing thugs for 70 years. And what you're seeing in Hamas is a tiny, tiny minority of people who are reflecting 0.01% of that violence back at its origin. You are seeing the effects of, unfortunately, Palestinians who have looked into the abyss of the moral horror that is Zionism, and it has looked into them, and they have taken on some of the traits of Zionists. When you talk about October 7th, you are talking about a few hours when some members of Hamas sunk to the level of a Zionist. That's how you should say it. You are talking about a few hours where 1,000 to 2,000 Hamas members carried out a military operation, and some minority of them acted with the moral depravity of the average Israeli soldier. That's what we're talking about.
I mean, I understand you want to dismiss the actions of Hamas and say it's an insignificant portion.
No, I don't dismiss it. I just don't give it undue disproportional attention relative to the far, far more morally abhorrent and far greater magnitude crimes of the Zionists. Like,
the Hamas may have been insignificant in the grand scheme of things in terms of just like total body count, but it wasn't for lack of trying. It was after significant attempts to degrade their military capabilities. The anchor that I always come back to is Israel is open to having peace treaties with its neighbors.
No, they're not.
Okay. They signed a peace treaty with Egypt. They signed a peace treaty with Jordan.
They're willing to a treaty with Egypt and Jordan after the Yom Kippur War.
Mm-hmm.
That was the thing.
After they got invaded.
Those militaries showed themselves to be a significant threat. And so Israel, in order to focus on its primary military objective of fighting the Palestinians, made peace with Jordan and Egypt. And one of the conditions of that was that the United States would provide Egypt with billions of dollars a year in military aid, which we have done ever since.
I mean, it's better than having constant invasions coming in from the Sinai Peninsula.
And what constant invasions? Israel has never been invaded from the Sinai. Never been invaded from the Sinai Peninsula. That has literally never happened.
what? How did the you're talking? Okay, you're making a distinction that because Israel had occupied the Sinai Peninsula between
Right.
after 1967,
On the one
that
occasion in 1973, Egypt sent a military force into its own territory
its
in
own
the
previous
Sinai.
territory. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, with no
Okay.
expectation, by the way, that they were going to conquer all of Israel. They didn't. They did not have that as their goal.
I mean, it's
I would
yeah.
refer you to
Okay,
Martin von Kriewald's definitive military history, "The Sword and the Olive." Martin von Kriewald is an impeccable military
sure. So
historian.
I only brought it up to distinguish it from the three no's that the Arab League, the declaration that they made in Khartoum, where it's like no peace, no treaty, with no recognition with Israel. So it's
Uh-huh.
a very different discrepancy between the two sides. One is like, hey, do you want Sinai back? Do you want West Bank back? Let's just like make recognition and make peace. And the Arab League saying no. Eventually, they did wisen up, and then they were more comfortable with the option of just peacefully coexisting with their neighbor. But some people are not getting the memo. I hope the Palestinians do get the memo soon.
Right, but that the belief that you have that Israelis are seeking peace and are willing to live in peace with their neighbors and the Palestinians, I think is false. You know, you mentioned peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt. You didn't mention any peace treaty with Lebanon, which Israel
Yeah,
has
Lebanon is
repeatedly
complex.
invaded and killed tens of thousands of Lebanese civilians,
Hmm.
leading to the formation of Hezbollah, which is an organization that has nothing to do with the Palestinians. It's just another organization that was created to fight Israel's military occupation.
I mean, they still wanted to get involved in the Palestinian in the war in Gaza.
Right.
So
That's called having allies. Like, that's called when sometimes you stand up for your allies.
right.
Like,
I mean, it's
it's a
unfortunate
thing.
that their allies also happen to be the biggest butchers of Arabs in the area. Their Hezbollah acted as foot soldiers for Bashar al-Assad. In terms of people that were killed, Arabs that were killed, they have the highest body count that I can think of.
I I don't think that that's true, but it's a
Which
really
part?
tangential point, and
Well,
like,
I'm
feel
saying
free to
like
send me a source on that.
which part that
Yeah, the
Hezbollah
idea
was used.
that Hezbollah are the greatest butchers of Arabs
Well, I
in
mean,
the
the
Arab
Syrian
world.
civil war has like 600, 700,000 dead, and Hezbollah
Yeah,
was
but that
like
they didn't do all of that, right?
right. They didn't do all of it, but in terms of proportion, like nothing else, they were the main shock troops for Bashar al-Assad.
They were the
And I
main
only
shock.
bring it up. I only bring it up not as a tangential point, but to highlight how I don't believe people's justifications at face value. It's the way it's similar to how the Houthis are heralded as, oh, they're just in solidarity with Gaza, until you point out that their slogan is a curse upon the Jews, and then it gets uncomfortable.
I mean, I don't have any issue with that skepticism, and I don't think there are a lot of really good people to support. I mean, I really would love to see you turn some of that skepticism on Israel,
I mean,
because you
there
seem
would
to
be
have
more
really
skepticism.
uncritically absorbed this really thin propaganda lie that Israel is seeking peace. That has
Well,
never been the case.
who first suggested having a peace treaty in recognition? Was it was it the Arab countries or Israel? That's a
I
simple
believe it was
question.
the Arab countries, but I could be wrong.
What?
No, like, show me.
Which what's like the first year that an Arab country was like, hey, how about we recognize you? That they
Oh,
beat Israel to the punch,
but I mean, why would they recognize an illegitimate apartheid
of
regime?
course, right?
Like,
So has Israel violated any of its peace treaties,
oh yeah,
either with Jordan or Egypt?
yes.
How?
The part of the peace treaty is an agreement about not stationing military forces on certain parts of the border, and they violated that when they went into Gaza. The forces that they have
Okay.
there controlling Gaza's southern boundary violate the peace treaty with Egypt.
Yeah, so as long as Hamas isn't around, it does seem like Israel does respect the international borders that that it has with countries that it establishes a treaty with, right?
So you don't think that a country has any obligation to respect the borders of another unless they have a treaty?
There's a heightened obligation when there is a treaty. The other
Right, that's true.
circumstances, huh?
So has Israel ever gone into Jordan?
I don't know. After they signed the peace treaty in
Yeah.
1991, I don't know if they have.
They there were two Mossad assassins caught in Jordan in
Oh, okay.
1994.
All right. That's bad.
I mean, this could be a whole other topic and a whole other talk. And let me preface this by saying I don't believe that Israel is fundamentally different than many other states, societies, and ideologies that have existed in the course of the world. It is not my position to state or to imply that they are somehow uniquely bad. And I would say that sometimes people who are trying to argue that they're uniquely bad are arguing from a place of implicit or explicit anti-Semitism. I would say
Okay.
that Israel are a militant, aggressive, expansionist society that are motivated by a religious sense of superiority and bigotry. And they're a society that has used external conflicts to paper over the large differences in the various sorts of Jews. That one of the ways that by having this conflict they have um, one of the ways they've formed their society is by presenting themselves to their own population as an island among a sea of hostility. But when you look for that hostility, it's not always there in the same way that it is presented as. Avi Shavit in the early 1990s, late 1980s, wrote a book about the Iron Wall. And this is taken from that essay by Jakubinsky that was in the sources that I provided. And this is the Zionist idea that the way you create peace eventually is by creating such an overwhelming military force, such an overwhelming domination that the Arabs just have to live with it. And one of the things
I
he
mean,
argues
that's
in there,
true with any country, is it not? I mean, it's like how Singapore has the biggest military and navy in Southeast Asia, even
well,
though
he
it's a
doesn't
tiny island.
he's not necessarily critical about that as a idea. Um and that's I don't bring it up necessarily to criticize it, although I think there are things about it that can be criticized. The point is that Israel had opportunities after 1949 to make peace with its neighbors, and instead they chose to invade Egypt in 1956 and to invade Jordan and Syria and Egypt in 1967 and then to invade Lebanon in 1979 and invade Lebanon
Why
again
did
in
they invade
1982.
Lebanon?
Why did they invade Lebanon?
Yeah, was there something going on in South Lebanon?
Nothing of significance.
Okay.
No, they wanted to invade. I mean,
What was it? So it just wasn't used as a staging ground to have attacks
sure.
by Palestinian Fedayeen? Okay. I mean, that's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
glossed
yeah.
over.
There were
Okay.
like there were like a scratch from there. I don't know if you read the part where I look at the civilian casualties inflicted by Israel in Gaza and propose that as a way of measuring civilian casualties in different aspects of the conflict. You know, like a Gaza month, a Gaza week, a Gaza day. If you were to do that exercise with Fayadeen operations from southern Lebanon, it would be about 6 Gaza hours over the course of several years. So,
Okay.
yeah, There were some Fedayeen attacks from Lebanon. I think all in all, less than 100 people were killed, and that was the purpose of 1979. Now, in 1982, there weren't Fedayeen attacks, and Yasser Arafat was determined not to provide Israel with any provocation to carry out the invasion that they were very self-evidently planning to do. So there were no attacks. And eventually, once Israel was ready to invade Lebanon, what they used was a renegade faction, formerly of the PLO, that were actually under a death sentence pronounced by Arafat, carried out an attack on Israel's ambassador in the UK, didn't kill anybody, wounded them. And they said, well, the PLO has attacked us, so now we're going to invade Lebanon.
Okay.
That was an unusually thin provocation, but that is, you can find other examples of this when Israel wants to invade the various surrounding countries.
And
So,
by the way, I'm gonna want to wrap up in like 5 minutes.
oh yeah,
But what you're saying sounds good as a wrap up.
So, yeah, I mean, we can talk about this again. My fundamental position is that everybody should have the right to vote and should be able to live in peace and dignity. I understand that you have real criticisms of how the Palestinians have carried out that struggle. And I think those criticisms are valid. And I think it's particularly important for people who are appealing to the world to recognize Israel's crimes and violations of human rights, that they make an effort to abide by the laws of war themselves. Otherwise, you are scorning something that you're later going to try and use as a shield. But
Yeah, I
I
have.
would encourage you to look more broadly at the history of anti-colonial movements, of resistance. And I think what you're going to find is the Palestinians are very typical, very ordinary. And the way that this is unfolded is, of course, not identical to any other conflict, but very comparable to the struggles in Algeria, in South Africa, in British India. Like, it's very ordinary.
Yeah, I don't agree that it's very ordinary. And I guess like my own wrap up is I'm not convinced that this they try to paper too much over their nationalistic and religious motivations. I think that's the primary motivator. And what you've outlined, like a brief snippet of the history that you've outlined, illustrates just how ineffectual violent resistance has been for the Palestinian cause. Even if you accept that they do have a legitimate motivation and that's what they're working towards, it's been nothing but failure and failure and failure and endless death and destruction. Even if you blame that on Israel's war crimes, their goal of their tactics just do not work. And there's no better illustration